There is an island sitting in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea that has been fought over for longer than most civilizations have existed. Greeks wanted it, Romans took it, Arabs held it, Normans seized it. And in the summer of 1943, two of the most driven, most competitive, and most complicated generals the Allied world had ever produced were about to spend 38 days racing each other across its sun-baked terrain, not just to beat the enemy, but to beat one another. Get comfortable. This one is going to take you all the way from the conference rooms of Washington and London, across the beaches of southern Sicily, through dusty inland towns and along coastal roads carved into cliffsides, and finally through the gates of Messina. And somewhere along that journey, you are going to understand something about ambition and rivalry and what it actually costs to win. If this is the kind of story that keeps you company at night, the kind that fills your mind with something real, something worth thinking about, something bigger than the ordinary noise of the day, then settle in. You found the right place. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because we do this kind of thing here. Long, careful, deeply researched stories told at the pace you actually want to hear them. No rushing, no skipping the parts that matter, just the full picture, from beginning to end. Now, back to the island. Sicily in 1943 was not simply a piece of geography. It was a hinge point. The Mediterranean had been a contested theatre for years by this stage, and the Allies had just finished the long, brutal work of clearing North Africa of Axis forces. That campaign had consumed enormous resources and longer than anyone originally planned, and when it finally closed in the spring of that year, the question on every senior commander's desk was the same: what comes next? The answer that emerged, through argument, negotiation, and the kind of high-level disagreement that tends to happen when the Americans and the British sit in the same room long enough, was Sicily, an island roughly 250 kilometers from east to west, sitting at the toe of the Italian boot, like a stone someone dropped into a narrow corridor. Capture it, and you open the central Mediterranean to Allied shipping. You remove a staging ground for Axis air power. You put pressure on mainland Italy itself, with all the political consequences that implied. You give yourself options. Options were exactly what the Allied leadership needed in the summer of 1943, when the war in Europe had not yet turned irreversibly in their favor, and when every decision carried the weight of everything still to be decided. But here is where the story becomes more than just strategy. Here is where it becomes human. The Allied plan to take Sicily, Operation Husky, as it would come to be known, placed two armies on the island simultaneously. One British, one American. Two separate chains of command, two separate national traditions, two separate ways of thinking about what war was for and how it ought to be fought. And at the head of each force, a general who did not particularly enjoy playing second to anyone. General Bernard Montgomery commanded the British Eighth Army. He had come through the North African campaign with a reputation for meticulous preparation and methodical advance. He was careful, deliberate, and absolutely convinced that his way of making war was the right way. He was not a man who welcomed improvisation, and he was not a man who found it easy to pretend that other people's ideas were as good as his own. His soldiers respected him. His peers found him, more often than not, infuriating. General George S. Patton, Jr. commanded the American Seventh Army. He had also come through North Africa, though his experience there had been rockier, marked by early setbacks and moments where American forces had been found wanting. Patton burned with something that went beyond ordinary military ambition. He had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of moment, and he was not prepared to let it pass as someone else's footnote. He wore his conviction loudly. He carried it in the way he dressed, the way he moved, the way he spoke to his men. He was either exactly what the moment required, or a man dangerously close to the edge of his own intensity, and often, depending on the day, he was both. Put these two men on the same island, give them overlapping objectives and a shared route to the most important city in Sicily, and what you get is not simply a military campaign. What you get is something closer to a contest, one fought in the dust and heat and physical exhaustion of a Mediterranean summer, but driven by something that no map could fully capture. The race to Messina did not begin the moment troops hit the beaches. It built slowly, through the early chaos of the landings, through the painful lessons of the first airborne operations, through the grinding work of consolidating beachheads and pushing inland. It crystallized in the days after the initial fighting, when it became clear that Montgomery's path along Sicily's eastern coast was not going as smoothly as planned, and that Patton, given just enough room to move, was capable of something extraordinary in terms of speed. From that point forward, the campaign had two stories running simultaneously. One was the operational story, Allied forces methodically dismantling Axis resistance, liberating towns, securing supply lines, and pushing toward the island's northeastern corner, where Messina waited. The other was the human story, two generals, each convinced the other was given more than he deserved, each determined to arrive first, each willing to push his men and his logistics and his relationships with his superiors to the absolute limit in service of that goal. That second story is what this documentary is really about. Because when you strip away the operational orders and the after-action reports and the careful language of headquarters communications, what you find underneath is something almost elemental. Two men who had devoted their lives to their profession, placed in direct competition, with an entire island as the prize and history itself watching. One of them would arrive at Messina first. One of them would spend the rest of the campaign, and in some ways the rest of his life, reckoning with what that meant. We are going to walk through all of it tonight. Every phase of the operation, from the planning conferences to the final push, the landings that nearly went wrong from the very first hours, the counterattacks that tested American resolve at the most vulnerable moment, the extraordinary westward sweep that gave Patton Palermo and a platform from which to pivot northward and then east, the slower, harder slog along the coast that Montgomery's forces endured against terrain and opposition that offered no easy answers, the quiet but ferocious competition for resources and air support, and finally, the last drive, the sprint really, to the gates of Messina, with the clock running and the whole Allied command watching to see who would get there first. This is a story about war, but more than that, it is a story about what drives the people who fight wars, the ambition that can be the difference between victory and defeat, and the same ambition that can cost a man everything he cares about. Sicily is waiting. The summer of 1943 is waiting. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the story carry you. There is an island that sits at the center of the Mediterranean like a keystone pressed between two worlds. To the north, the Italian peninsula reaches down as though trying to reclaim it. To the south, the coast of Tunisia lies close enough that on a clear morning you might almost convince yourself you could see one from the other. To the east, the Strait of Messina, a narrow corridor of water barely 3 kilometers wide at its tightest point, separates Sicily from the toe of the Italian boot. The island is not large by the standards of contested ground, but its position on the map made it something that military planners in the middle of the 20th century understood immediately. Whoever held Sicily held the passage between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and whoever held that passage held significant influence over the entire war in the south. By the beginning of 1943, the war had been running for more than 3 years, and the Allies found themselves at a crossroads that demanded a decision. The campaigns in North Africa were grinding toward their conclusion. After years of fighting across the Libyan and Tunisian deserts, the last major Axis forces on the African continent were being compressed into a narrowing perimeter around Tunis. Their eventual collapse was no longer a question of whether, but when, and that inevitable moment would leave more than 500,000 Allied soldiers, American, British, Canadian, French and others, camped across the North African shore with the next objective entirely unresolved. Where would they go? What came after Africa? The answer, for many in the senior Allied leadership, pointed directly across the water toward that triangular island whose western tip was closer to Tunisia than most European capitals are to their nearest neighbours. The strategic logic for targeting Sicily was not complicated to state, though it was considerably harder to act upon. Italy remained in the war as a German ally, contributing forces across multiple theatres while providing the Axis with bases, ports, and the psychological weight of a founding fascist power. If the Allies could strike Sicily and then carry momentum onto the Italian mainland, the pressure on Rome might fracture that alliance entirely, removing Italy as a fighting partner for Germany and forcing Berlin to divert divisions southward to defend a new front. Beyond Italy's fate, there was the Mediterranean sea lane itself, that great corridor through which Allied shipping had to move if Britain and its partners wanted to supply operations in the Middle East and beyond without routing every convoy around the entire southern tip of Africa. With Axis air and naval power still operating from Sicilian and Sardinian bases, that passage remained dangerous and costly. Neutralizing those bases would shorten supply routes, free up vessels, and remove a chronic pressure point from Allied logistics. The conversations that produced what would eventually be called Operation Husky happened in a series of high-level meetings stretching across the early months of 1943. At Casablanca in January of that year, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met with their senior military staffs and wrestled with exactly this question of where the Mediterranean War should go after North Africa. The British position, shaped heavily by Churchill's long-held strategic instincts, favoured exploiting the Mediterranean opportunity, striking at what the Prime Minister famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, though the months ahead would demonstrate that particular metaphor was far more optimistic than the geography warranted. The American position was more divided. Senior American planners, particularly those oriented toward an eventual cross-channel invasion of northwestern Europe, worried that a Mediterranean campaign might absorb resources and attention that should be building toward France. They feared the Mediterranean becoming a strategic drain, a theatre that kept expanding its appetite while the larger objective waited. What emerged from Casablanca and from subsequent planning sessions was a compromise that carried the particular characteristics all such compromises carry. It gave both sides enough of what they wanted to secure agreement while leaving certain tensions unresolved. Sicily would be the target. The operation would aim to seize the island, relieve pressure on Allied shipping through the central Mediterranean, and create conditions for possible further operations against Italy proper. Crucially, the decision to invade Sicily was not automatically a commitment to invade mainland Italy. That question was left deliberately open, which suited the American planners who feared being drawn further in, while leaving Churchill room to argue for continuation. The combined chiefs of staff approved the outline concept, and the detailed planning work passed to the commanders who would actually have to execute it. General Dwight Eisenhower sat at the top of the Allied command structure in the Mediterranean, a position that required him to be as much diplomat as soldier. Below him, the ground forces for the Sicilian operation would be organized into two distinct armies, each with its own commander and its own operational sector. The British Eighth Army, by the beginning of 1943, already carrying the weight of its desert campaigns as a kind of institutional identity, would land on the southeastern corner of the island. The American Seventh Army, newer, less battle-tested in the eyes of some Allied observers, still carrying the sting of early setbacks in Tunisia, would land on the southern coast to the west of the British sector. The two armies would advance together, oriented broadly northward toward the island's far coast. At least, that was the plan as conceived on the maps and conference tables of Allied headquarters in North Africa. Sicily itself is not the kind of terrain that surrenders easily. The island covers roughly 25,000 square kilometers, not vast, but considerably more complex than its small outline on a Mediterranean map suggests. The interior rises into rugged hills and mountain ridges that channel movement, punish logistics, and reward defenders who know the ground. Mount Etna, the great volcanic mass in the island's northeast, rises to more than 3,000 meters and dominates the approaches to the city of Catania on the eastern coast with a geographic authority that no amount of operational planning could simply override. The road network in the interior was limited, and the summer heat, Sicily in July and August is fierce and unrelenting, would bear down on men and machines alike. Planners who looked at the island's topography understood that the physical ground would be as much an obstacle as any Axis division. The Axis garrison on Sicily in the spring and early summer of 1943 was a mixed force of uncertain quality. Italian units formed the bulk of the island's defenders, organized into static and mobile divisions of varying readiness and morale. German forces were present as well, two divisions that would prove to be of far higher quality and combat effectiveness than most of their Italian counterparts, and these German formations would become the primary concern of Allied commanders as the campaign unfolded. The overall Axis strength on the island was substantial on paper, but the command relationship between Italian and German forces was complicated by questions of authority, distrust, and the fundamental difference in strategic commitment between a German army fighting for its ideology and an Italian army fighting for a cause that many of its members had already begun to privately doubt. Allied intelligence efforts ahead of the operation produced one of the more remarkable deception achievements of the entire war. An operation designed to suggest that the real Allied target lay elsewhere, perhaps Sardinia, perhaps Greece, fed false information into Axis channels in ways that influenced where German strategic reserves were positioned in the crucial weeks before the landings. The details of how this deception was constructed and executed belong to one of the stranger chapters of wartime intelligence work, but its effect mattered. When Allied forces came ashore in Sicily, they did not encounter the full weight of Axis reinforcement that a fully alert defense might have prepared. The men who would actually make the crossing, hundreds of thousands of soldiers loading onto transports and landing craft across the ports of North Africa, carried the weight of the operation in ways that the generals at headquarters did not. For an American infantryman who had spent months training in the dust of the Tunisian rear, or a British soldier who had already marched across the western desert and back, Sicily represented the next unknown. The strategic rationale that animated conferences in Washington and London had no particular presence in the mind of a man checking his equipment on a transport ship. What he knew was simpler and more immediate. There was an island across the water. There were men on it who would try to stop him from landing. And somewhere on the other side of whatever came next, there might be a road that eventually led toward home. Operation Husky was formally approved, and the detailed planning pushed forward through the spring months, with a target date set for early July. The combined weight of Allied planning, logistics, deception, and will was being organized around a single objective: to put armies ashore on a hostile coast, to fight across difficult ground in summer heat, and to drive the Axis from an island that sat at the center of a sea the Allies needed to control. What the planning could not fully anticipate, what no plan ever fully anticipates, was the particular chemistry that would develop between the two men who would command those armies on the ground, and how that chemistry would shape the campaign in ways that the maps and conference tables could never quite predict. Before the first soldier stepped onto Sicilian soil, the campaign had already become something more than a military operation. It had become a contest of personalities, two men whose visions of war, whose hungers for recognition, and whose fundamental beliefs about how battles should be fought were almost perfectly opposed. General George Smith Patton Jr. and General Bernard Montgomery did not simply disagree about tactics, they disagreed about nearly everything that mattered in the art of command. And Sicily, that sun-scorched island wedged between continents, would become the arena where their rivalry moved from private irritation to something the whole Allied world would eventually notice. George Patton had been preparing for a moment like this for most of his adult life. Born in 1885, into a family steeped in military tradition, his grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy. Patton absorbed the idea that soldiers existed to achieve glory, that war was the highest human calling, and that a commander's duty was to attack, to advance, and to make the enemy react, rather than the other way around. He had graduated from West Point, competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm, and served under General John Pershing during the punitive expedition into Mexico. By the time the First World War came, Patton had established himself as one of the American Army's earliest tank enthusiasts, a man who saw in armored warfare the speed and shock that could turn a stagnant front line into something fluid and decisive. That passion had not diminished in the 25 years since. If anything, the waiting had intensified it. His physical presence was studied and deliberate. The ivory-handled pistols, the highly polished helmet, the posture of a man perpetually conscious of how he appeared to those around him, these were not accidents. Patton understood that command was partly theatre, that soldiers needed to believe their general was larger than ordinary men, and he invested enormous energy in projecting exactly that image. He was profane, volatile, and capable of sudden eruptions of temper that left subordinates shaken. He was also, when the situation demanded it, capable of extraordinary charm. His diary entries and private letters reveal a man simultaneously supremely confident and privately tortured by the fear that history might pass him by. He had tasted success in North Africa, commanding the Second Corps after its bruising defeat at the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, and had rebuilt that formation's morale and discipline in a matter of weeks. But success in North Africa had come late, had been partial, and had been shared. Sicily, Patton believed, was where he would prove what he could truly do. Bernard Montgomery operated from a completely different place. Born in 1887 in London, the son of a bishop, Montgomery had endured a famously cold and difficult relationship with his mother throughout his childhood, a deprivation of warmth that some who knew him believed had shaped his later psychological makeup in permanent ways. He survived the First World War's Western Front at enormous personal cost, being shot through the lung at the First Battle of Ypres, and that experience of catastrophic loss, of watching men fed into battles poorly planned and indifferently led, had left him with a near-obsessive commitment to preparation, to knowing his ground, to ensuring that nothing was left to chance before the first order was given. Where Patton saw speed as the weapon, Montgomery saw certainty. Where Patton was willing to accept improvisation as the price of momentum, Montgomery was willing to accept delay as the price of order. By the time of Sicily, Montgomery carried the enormous weight of El Alamein. His victory over Rommel's Afrika Korps at El Alamein in October and November of 1942 had made him the most celebrated British general of the war, a household name at home, a figure of almost totemic significance to the British public after years of reversal and disappointment. He had exploited that celebrity with ruthless efficiency, cultivating an image of quiet, intellectual certainty, the black beret, the direct and often blunt manner of speaking, the refusal to pretend that he found anyone particularly impressive. He wore his confidence as armor, and he was not subtle about his conviction that he was the finest operational commander the Allies possessed. To Montgomery, this was not vanity. It was simply an assessment of the evidence. He had defeated Rommel. He had driven the Axis from North Africa. These were facts, and facts did not require apology. The friction between these two men had roots that preceded Sicily by many months. They had circled each other in North Africa with a mutual wariness that occasionally broke through into open contempt. Patton found Montgomery insufferably slow, precious about his preparations, unwilling to take the risks that could turn tactical success into strategic transformation. He privately, and not always privately, referred to Montgomery with a sharpness that stopped just short of insubordination. Montgomery, for his part, regarded Patton as flashy, undisciplined, and prone to the kind of reckless urgency that got men killed for the sake of a general's vanity. They were not enemies in any simple sense. There was, beneath the rivalry, a grudging professional respect. Both men understood that the other was serious about the craft of war. But respect, in their case, coexisted comfortably with disdain. Their respective command styles extended down through their armies, in ways that would define how the Sicilian campaign actually unfolded on the ground. Patton expected his subordinates to move fast, to make decisions, to push forward, even when the situation was uncertain. He believed that the enemy's confusion was a resource to be exploited before it resolved itself, and that hesitation at the front was more dangerous than a bold mistake. His commanders learned quickly that being caught standing still was more dangerous than being caught in a forward position they could not fully justify. The energy flowed downward from Patton, insistent and sometimes frightening, and his army moved with a kinetic quality that was unmistakable. Montgomery's army moved differently, methodically, with each phase coordinated, each flank secured before the next bound began. His subordinates understood that the plan was the plan, that deviating from it without authority was not initiative but indiscipline. Both approaches had produced results. Both had also produced failures. What made the situation in Sicily particularly charged was the command architecture that had been laid over the campaign. General Harold Alexander, commanding the overall ground forces under the Allied designation of 15th Army Group, was responsible for coordinating both Patton's 7th Army and Montgomery's 8th Army. Alexander was a capable diplomat and a man of enormous personal decency, but his instinct when managing difficult personalities was to accommodate rather than to confront, to find the arrangement that produced the least friction rather than the one that demanded the hardest decisions. In North Africa, this had generally meant deferring to Montgomery, whose seniority and reputation within the British system carried enormous weight. Patton had noticed this pattern. He had filed it away with the quiet intensity of a man who does not forget what he considers an injustice, and he arrived at the planning stages of Operation Husky, already convinced that the command structure was tilted against him. There was a national dimension to this rivalry that neither man could entirely separate from the personal one. By the middle of 1943, the United States had committed enormous resources to the war in Europe and the Mediterranean, but American commanders, in British estimation, still lacked the deep institutional experience that came from 3 years of continuous fighting. This judgment, stated openly or merely implied, produced a resentment that ran through the American officer corps. Patton felt it acutely. He was not prepared to accept that American soldiers were a supporting act in someone else's war, or that Montgomery's Eighth Army was the principal instrument of Allied victory. He believed, and said as much in the company of those he trusted, that an American army properly commanded and properly launched could move faster and hit harder than any British formation that had ever taken the field. Sicily was going to be his chance to demonstrate that, and he knew it. As the planning for Operation Husky moved through its final stages in the spring of 1943, the two men brought these histories, these grievances, and these ambitions into the same rooms and the same maps. The initial operational design would assign Montgomery's Eighth Army the more prominent role, driving northward along the eastern coast toward Catania and then Messina. Patton's Seventh Army would protect the British left flank, a role that struck Patton as not merely secondary but actively diminishing. He had not rebuilt American prestige in North Africa and assembled one of the most capable armored formations in the Allied order of battle in order to guard someone else's flank. The tension was structural before it was personal, built into the very architecture of the plan that would send both armies onto Sicilian soil in the early hours of the 10th of July 1943. What neither man could fully predict, and what neither operational plan could fully account for, was the degree to which events on the ground would overturn the assumptions of the planning table. Wars have a way of invalidating careful arrangements almost from the moment they begin, and Sicily would be no exception. The terrain, the enemy, the weather, the friction of combat, all of these would reshape the campaign in the days and weeks that followed. But the personalities were fixed. Patton was not going to become cautious. Montgomery was not going to become reckless. The collision between their visions was not a contingency to be managed. It was a feature of the campaign as certain as the island's mountains and as constant as its summer heat. And from that collision, slowly and at enormous human cost, the outcome that history records would eventually emerge. Before a single soldier could set foot on Sicilian soil, an army of planners had to build the invasion from scratch. In the early months of 1943, Allied headquarters in North Africa became a kind of controlled storm, maps pinned across walls, couriers crossing between offices, and officers from a dozen different commands arguing over coastlines they had never seen. The operation that would become known as Husky was not born fully formed. It was hammered out through weeks of debate, compromise, and occasional outright disagreement, shaped as much by the personalities in the room as by the strategic logic on the table. Getting two major Allied armies to operate as a coordinated whole was itself a problem of staggering complexity, and the men tasked with solving it understood that the planning decisions made in those conference rooms would echo across every hour of the campaign to come. At the center of it all sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in the Mediterranean, whose gift, and burden was holding together an alliance that was always one bad decision away from fracture. The fundamental question facing Allied planners was not whether to take Sicily, but how. The island is shaped roughly like a triangle, its northeastern corner pointing toward the Italian mainland across the Strait of Messina, which at its narrowest is barely a few kilometers wide. Any rational reading of the map told you that Messina was the prize. Control it, and you seal the island off, trapping whatever Axis forces could not escape. The problem was getting there. Sicily is not a small place. It stretches more than 250 kilometers from west to east and encompasses rugged interior terrain that favors defenders, broken by river valleys, volcanic rock, and roads that twist through narrow passes. Planners had to decide where to land, how many forces to commit, how to sustain them once ashore, and how to sequence the advance. Every answer generated a new set of problems, and the early planning sessions were often chaotic enough to rival the battlefield itself. The initial proposals put forward in the first weeks of planning reflected the ambitions of the British Eighth Army's commander. Montgomery had strong opinions about how the operation should be structured, and he made those opinions known through formal channels and informal pressure alike. His early preference was for a concentrated landing on the southeastern corner of the island, centering the British effort around the Gulf of Noto and pushing directly northward along the eastern coast toward Catania and then Messina. He was deeply skeptical of dispersed landings that spread force across too wide a front, arguing that concentration was essential to mass enough combat power to punch through any serious resistance. His logic was not unreasonable, but it was also shaped by the assumption that the British Eighth Army would be the main effort, the force that drove deepest and fastest toward the objective. The American role, in his initial conception, was largely supporting. Patton's men would protect the British left flank and secure the western part of the island. It was a design that, not surprisingly, did not sit well with the Americans. The friction this generated was both professional and deeply personal. American commanders, including Patton and his direct superior General Omar Bradley, understood clearly what a supporting role would mean, not just operationally, but in terms of public perception, political standing, and the long argument about whether American forces could be trusted to perform alongside their more experienced British counterparts. The British had been at war longer, had fought across North Africa in campaigns that had tested and ultimately refined their army, and some among them wore that experience as a quiet badge of superiority. The Americans were newer to the fight, had stumbled at Kasserine Pass only months earlier, and were acutely aware that their credibility was still being established. Accepting a peripheral role in Husky felt, to many American officers, like conceding a point they were not prepared to concede. The planning process thus became, beneath its formal surface, a negotiation about status as much as strategy. Eisenhower navigated this tension with the patience of a diplomat and the authority of a commander who understood that coalition warfare demands tolerance for friction. He did not allow the disagreements to become ruptures, but neither did he fully resolve them. He managed them, pushing toward compromises that kept both armies engaged and both nations invested in the operation's success. The final plan that emerged assigned Montgomery's Eighth Army the southeastern coastline, with landings stretching from the Gulf of Noto northward towards Syracuse. Patton's Seventh Army would land further west, along the Gulf of Gela, covering a broad stretch of the southern coast. The two forces would advance generally northward, with the British driving up the eastern side of the island toward Catania and ultimately Messina, and the Americans securing the western interior and protecting the British flank. It was a plan built on careful balance, arguably too careful, critics would later argue, to produce the decisive speed the operation required. The logistical dimensions of the plan were staggering in their complexity. Husky would involve more than 150,000 troops in its initial waves, drawn from across the Allied world. Americans, British, Canadians, and supporting forces from a range of nations. These men had to be transported from ports scattered across North Africa and the Middle East, loaded onto landing craft and transport ships, and delivered to beaches at precisely timed intervals. The naval component alone involved thousands of vessels of every conceivable type, coordinated across hundreds of kilometers of open water. Air support required careful sequencing to avoid congesting airspace over the beaches and to ensure that fighter cover was available at the right moments without interfering with the landing craft below. Supply chains had to be planned not just for the landing itself, but for what came after, the days and weeks when the army ashore would need fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies delivered across beaches that had been, until recently, defended enemy territory. Water was among the more prosaic but genuinely serious concerns. Sicily in July is brutally hot, and an army advancing through its interior would consume enormous quantities of fresh water in addition to everything else. Planners worked through these calculations with meticulous care, because an army that runs short of water in a Sicilian summer stops moving, and an army that stops moving loses races. The fuel requirements for a mechanized advance were similarly daunting. Patton, in particular, intended to use armor and motorized infantry at speed, which meant keeping the supply lines running forward even as the front lines shifted daily. Getting the logistics right was not a glamorous problem, but it was in many ways the most important one. Operational boldness without logistical foundation is simply another name for disaster. The airborne component of the plan added its own layer of complexity and, ultimately, controversy. Allied planners had come to believe strongly in the value of vertical envelopment, dropping troops behind enemy lines to seize critical points before the main landing force arrived. The concept was sound in theory, but translating it into practice over Sicily required threading together the movements of transport aircraft, the timing of beach landings, the identification of suitable drop zones, and the coordination of ground forces who would need to link up with the paratroopers within hours. The planning for the airborne drops was never fully satisfying, and the men who studied it most closely harbored private doubts that they did not always voice loudly enough. Those doubts would prove justified, but that reckoning was still weeks away. Beneath all of this ran the political current that Eisenhower could never entirely suppress. The Americans were fighting to prove something, and the British were fighting to remain the senior partner in an alliance that was shifting in weight toward the United States with every passing month. American industry and manpower were beginning to flow into the war at a scale that would eventually dwarf the British contribution, and both sides understood, without always saying it directly, that the relationship between the two nations was changing. Husky was taking place at a moment of transition, and the planning process reflected that. British officers who had spent years at war sometimes treated their American counterparts with a condescension they did not fully recognize in themselves. American officers who bristled at that condescension sometimes let pride override judgment. Eisenhower stood between these currents, trying to redirect them into something useful. The final planning document was not a perfect instrument. It represented the best compromise that could be achieved among commanders with genuinely different visions, operating under the pressure of a deadline that could not be moved. The invasion had to happen in the summer of 1943, before the weather turned, and before the Axis could further reinforce the island. There was no time to resolve every disagreement. no space to find the elegant solution that satisfied everyone. Eisenhower approved the plan knowing its weaknesses, knowing the friction points between his commanders, knowing that the moment the operation began, the carefully constructed agreements would start to bend under the pressure of events. That is the nature of planning for war. You build the best structure you can, and then you watch reality tear pieces of it away. What the planners could not fully anticipate was the degree to which individual initiative and personal ambition would shape the campaign once it was underway. Plans, as any experienced soldier will tell you, survive contact with the enemy only in fragments. The broad strokes of Husky's design, the British on the eastern coast, the Americans on the south and west, would remain recognizable throughout the campaign. But the spirit of the plan, the careful allocation of roles and credit, would erode almost immediately under the pressure of opportunity, rivalry, and the unpredictable behavior of an enemy that had its own ideas about how the battle should be fought. Two armies were loading onto ships across the North African coast, driven by two commanders who each intended, in his own way, to win this campaign. The plan said they would share the effort. The men involved had other ideas, and the island of Sicily, ancient and indifferent, waited under the July sun for what was coming. The North African coast in the early summer of 1943 held a particular quality of stillness in the hours before dawn. Across the ports and staging areas that stretched from Tunisia to Egypt, hundreds of thousands of men went about the unremarkable business of preparation, cleaning rifles, checking webbing, writing letters home that might never be answered. The great machinery of an Allied invasion was assembling itself piece by piece, and most of the men caught inside it understood only fragments of the larger picture. They knew they were going somewhere. They knew it would be soon. The precise shape of what waited for them on the other side of the water remained deliberately obscured, a matter of operational security that compressed anxiety into a kind of enforced patience. For these soldiers, the weeks before the 10th of July 1943 were defined not by grand strategy, but by the exhausting, repetitive, quietly anxious work of getting ready. The American 7th Army drew its strength from divisions that had already been tested in North Africa, men who had crossed from green uncertainty at places like Kasserine Pass to something harder and more reliable through months of difficult fighting. General Patton understood, perhaps better than most commanders of his generation, that an army's confidence was as fragile and as essential as any physical supply. He had inherited formations that had been shaken, and he had applied himself to the task of reshaping them with the same intensity he brought to everything else. His insistence on discipline, on saluting, on proper uniform, on the visible rituals of military bearing, struck some soldiers as theatrical vanity. What it actually represented was a calculated effort to rebuild pride from the outside in, to make men carry themselves like soldiers until they believed themselves to be soldiers again. By the time the invasion convoys began to assemble, that effort had largely succeeded. Training exercises along the North African coastline were designed to simulate, as faithfully as available resources allowed, the conditions that assault forces would face. Soldiers practiced climbing down cargo nets into landing craft while the vessels pitched in the swell. Engineers rehearsed the clearance of beach obstacles. Artillery crews worked through the complex calculations of fire support in uncertain terrain. The landings themselves had to be rehearsed against time as much as against geography. The window between first light and full daylight. The race to push off the exposed beaches before enemy forces could concentrate their response. Some exercises went well, others revealed problems that needed fixing, and fixing them consumed the kind of careful, unglamorous work that never appears in histories but without which invasions fail. Staff officers worked through the night, revising loading plans and timing schedules by the light of single bulbs in canvas headquarters tents. The British and Canadian forces assembling under General Montgomery's 8th Army brought their own particular culture to the work of preparation. These were formations that had been fighting in the desert for years, men who had learned to navigate the cruel arithmetic of limited supplies, brutal heat, and an enemy who was often technically superior in equipment, if not always in resolve. They carried a distinct professional competence, a soldier's matter-of-fact relationship with hardship that was both an asset and occasionally an obstacle. Montgomery trusted his formations deeply, and they trusted him in return. But trust of that kind cuts both ways. It creates cohesion, and it can also reinforce existing habits of thought in ways that make adaptation slower. The men loading stores and equipment onto landing craft in the Tunisian ports were skilled, experienced, and largely aware that Sicily would be harder than the empty desert had prepared them to expect. The logistics of moving an entire invasion force across open water to a defended coastline represented a challenge of a different order from anything the Mediterranean theatre had previously attempted. Supply officers dealt in numbers that would have seemed fantastical even a year earlier. Tens of thousands of vehicles, artillery pieces numbering in the hundreds, ammunition counted in tons rather than rounds. Every item had to be catalogued, prioritized, and packed into landing ships in precisely the right sequence, because anything loaded last would be unloaded first, and the sequence of arrival on a contested beach could determine whether the assault survived its first hours. The men who managed these logistics rarely appeared in the same dispatches as the combat soldiers they served, but the weight of what they carried was no less real for being administrative rather than physical. For individual soldiers, preparation had a texture that existed well below the level of strategy. Men who smoked more than usual. Card games lasted longer into the evening than was strictly advisable. Letters were written with a kind of deliberate care that differed from ordinary correspondence. The careful avoid-play of anything that might sound like farewell, and yet the unmistakable presence of it between every line. Some men sent home small objects, a ring, a photograph, a pocket Bible with a particular page marked. Some sought out chaplains, some avoided them entirely, preferring the familiar company of their section or squad to the conversations that a chaplain's presence inevitably invited. The human range of responses to imminent danger is wide, and the weeks before the landing encompassed very nearly all of it. Patton, characteristically, made himself visible throughout this period. He appeared at unit reviews, at training exercises, at embarkation points, not merely to inspect but to project. He understood that his own bearing was itself a form of communication, that the men watching him pass were reading something in the set of his jaw and the straightness of his posture that no order of the day could convey as efficiently. His speeches to assembled units had a quality that divided opinion sharply. Some soldiers found them galvanizing, even electrifying. Others found them excessive, almost theatrical in their profanity and their aggression. But even those who rolled their eyes in private admitted, more often than not, that something remained with them afterward, some residue of intent, some sharpening of focus. Whatever else Patton was, he was not forgettable. Montgomery's approach to the pre-invasion period was characteristically methodical. He ensured that his formations understood the plan in as much detail as security permitted, a philosophical departure from the tradition of confining operational information to officers, which reflected his belief that soldiers fight more effectively when they understand the purpose behind their movements. He held briefings. He reviewed intelligence assessments. He worked through the specific challenges of the eastern landing sectors with the care of a man who distrusted improvisation and placed his faith instead in thorough preparation. Those who served under him would not have described him as warm in the way that more instinctive commanders sometimes are, but they would have described him as serious, and in the weeks before an amphibious assault, seriousness counted for a great deal. The airborne forces presented their own particular challenge in the preparation phase. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division were undergoing the specialized rehearsals that night drop operations required. Formations of transport aircraft flying navigation exercises over the featureless sea, Pathfinder teams practicing the emplacement of guidance equipment, jump masters reviewing procedures that would need to be executed in darkness and noise and confusion. The inherent difficulty of night airborne operations had been understood theoretically for years. What had not yet been understood, not fully, was the degree to which theory would give way to catastrophe when the variables compounded. The rehearsals went well enough to generate confidence. That confidence would carry a significant cost. Along the docks and embarkation points, the physical transformation of a fighting force into a seaborne invasion was a process both massive and mundane. Vehicles were waterproofed, engines sealed, air intakes extended to allow wading through the surf. Equipment was checked against manifests and loaded with painstaking care. Landing ships took on their cargoes of men and material with a grinding, methodical efficiency that belied the enormity of what they were being prepared to do. Soldiers found bunks in the holds of vessels that had been built for carrying cargo rather than passengers, and they adapted to the particular discomfort of life below decks, with the flexibility that military service tends to teach quite effectively. The Mediterranean in early July is not a cold sea, and the close quarters of a packed transport ship were warm long before they became uncomfortable. There was, among many of the men preparing to sail, a recognition, sometimes spoken, more often simply present, that Sicily represented a threshold of a different kind from anything they had previously crossed. North Africa had been a campaign to establish a foothold, to prove that Allied ground forces could defeat Axis armies. Sicily was the beginning of something else, the opening of a long road that every serious observer understood would eventually lead through Italy to the heart of occupied Europe. The men loading their weapons and their rations and their personal effects onto ships in the Tunisian summer heat could not see that road in its full length, but they could feel its beginning beneath their feet. It gave the ordinary work of preparation a weight that was difficult to name precisely, but impossible to ignore. By the final days before the fleet sailed, the camps that had been full of noise and activity began to empty with a strange speed, as if the machinery of the invasion were swallowing everything around it. The cooking fires that had marked the presence of thousands of men went cold. The dust of vehicle convoys settled over abandoned tent lines. What remained was the sea, and the ships riding at anchor in the gathering dusk, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Sicily, waiting with no particular concern for the plans that had been laid against it. The men aboard those ships, American, British, Canadian, had done everything that preparation could be asked to do. What came next would depend on something preparation could approximate but never fully deliver: the capacity to adapt when every plan met the irreducible disorder of actual combat. The Mediterranean does not sleep gently. In the small hours of the 10th of July 1943, the sea around Sicily churned beneath a sky still dark, still restless from the tail end of a storm that had nearly cancelled everything. Winds had been running at 30 to 40 knots across the invasion corridor for most of the previous evening, and the forecasts had not been encouraging. But the machinery of Operation Husky had grown too vast to stop. More than 3,000 ships and landing craft now threaded their way toward the Sicilian coastline, carrying the weight of an Allied strategy months in the making. Below decks, soldiers lay in their bunks or sat in silence against bulkheads, listening to the groan of the hulls and the rising pulse of their own breathing. Some wrote letters they had already written twice. Some tried to eat. Most simply waited, which is perhaps the hardest thing a soldier can ever be asked to do. The island they were approaching was roughly 260 kilometers from west to east, shaped like a rough triangle and defended by more than 200,000 Axis troops. Though the quality of those defenders varied enormously, a fact that would matter greatly before the day was out. The naval armada assembling offshore was a sight that had no real comparison in any previous operation of the war. British and American warships arranged themselves in their designated fire support positions with the precision that only months of coordination could produce, their gun barrels elevated and ready, their fire control teams tracking pre-registered targets along the beaches and the low ridgelines behind them. The plan called for landings along a front stretching roughly 160 kilometers of coastline. American 7th Army, under General Patton, hitting beaches in the Gulf of Gela and along the southern shore, while British 8th Army, under General Montgomery, came ashore further east, in the Gulf of Syracuse and around the Pacino Peninsula. The intention was a broad, simultaneous assault that would overwhelm the defenders at multiple points, prevent any concentration of Axis reserves, and establish two separate but mutually supporting lodgements before the enemy could mount a coherent response. On paper, the plan had a clean logic. On the water, in the dark, in winds that had already thrown landing craft off course, nothing would be clean. The airborne operation had gone in first, hours before the amphibious waves, and the news from those drops was already troubling. American paratroopers, tasked with securing key road junctions and preventing Axis armored reserves from reaching the beaches, had been scattered by the same winds that were making the sea crossing so difficult. Sticks of men were dropped miles from their intended targets, some into the sea, some into isolated terrain with no immediate orientation, some so dispersed that they could not form any coherent fighting unit in the darkness. British airborne troops landing by glider further east fared no better. Many gliders released too early came down into the water short of land, with terrible consequences for those aboard. The chaos of those early hours was not the controlled, precise insertion that planners had envisioned. It was fragmented, frightening, and deeply costly. Yet in its disorder it created an unexpected effect. Small groups of scattered paratroopers, fighting independently across a wide area, convinced some Axis commanders that an enormous force had already penetrated deep inland, sowing a confusion that would work to the advantage of the men coming in from the sea. The first amphibious waves hit the beaches in the hours before first light. On the American sector, assault troops from the 1st Infantry Division and the 45th Infantry Division, among others, pushed toward shore in landing craft that had been tossed and swamped by the running sea. Men who had never been seasick became so. Equipment shifted, and seawater came over the ramps before they were even close to shore. When the ramps dropped and soldiers stepped into the Mediterranean, sometimes into water at the chest, sometimes deeper, the combination of physical exhaustion, nausea, soaking gear, and the absolute darkness in front of them tested every instinct they had. Some beaches met immediate fire. Others were quiet in a way that felt like a question nobody wanted answered. Naval gunfire opened up along the coast, shells arcing overhead with a sound like tearing cloth, detonating against coastal batteries and defensive positions that had been carefully mapped from aerial reconnaissance over the preceding weeks. The Italian coastal divisions assigned to defend southern Sicily presented a wildly inconsistent opponent. Some units dissolved almost on contact, their soldiers melting away from fixed positions into the interior before the first Allied troops even made the shore. These were men who had been conscripted from a country whose population had already grown deeply ambivalent about a war fought alongside Germany, and whose officers had sometimes lost control of morale long before the invasion fleet appeared on the horizon. But other Italian units and their artillery batteries held longer than expected, especially where terrain and prepared positions gave them a genuine advantage over men stumbling up from the waterline in the dark. The contrast was striking. In some sectors, American and British troops moved inland with almost no resistance. In others, the fighting for the first few hundred meters of Sicilian soil was brutal and close. The Germans had positioned their more reliable mobile reserves further inland, a deliberate choice based on the assumption that the Allies' amphibious firepower made any fixed coastal defense ultimately futile. This calculation was sound, but it also meant that the critical first hours of the landing, when the Allied forces were most vulnerable, compressed onto narrow beaches with their vehicles and heavy equipment still offshore, passed without the crushing armoured counterattack that might have driven them back into the sea. German commanders who sensed the opportunity were hampered by uncertainty about where exactly the main effort was being made, by disrupted communications, and in some areas by the lingering confusion sown by those scattered paratroopers still fighting their way through the darkness far from their drop zones. Every hour that passed without a coordinated Axis response was an hour the Allies used to consolidate. By the time the Sicilian coastline began to lighten toward grey and then toward the pale gold of a July dawn, the broad shape of what was happening started to become legible. American forces held a continuous, if thin, strip of beach across the Gulf of Gela. British forces had established their footholds to the east, including the seizure of the port at Syracuse, which fell with surprising speed and would prove enormously valuable in the days to come. The morning brought not just light, but the spectacle of the offshore fleet in its full enormity, ships stretching to every horizon, a visible expression of Allied industrial and organizational power that must have struck those who saw it from shore, whether as liberators or as defenders, as something almost beyond reckoning. Sailors from the naval support ships maintained their positions through the morning, despite occasional air attack, their guns responding to calls for fire from infantry units pushing inland against pockets of resistance. Inland from the beach at Gela, the going was heavier. Axis forces that had not dissolved made use of every natural feature, the rolling ground behind the beaches, dry stone walls, farmhouses, patches of scrub, to slow the American advance and make each few hundred meters a separate, exhausting contest. Communication between units was intermittent. The radio equipment soaked in the surf landing sometimes refused to work, which threw officers back onto runners and direct observation in ways that felt more like a much older kind of war. Leadership in those morning hours was intensely personal and intensely local, junior officers and sergeants making decisions without clear guidance from above, pushing men forward on little more than training and the understanding that the beach behind them was not a place to stay. The sand was already cluttered with equipment, wounded men, and the evidence of the approach: discarded life preservers, empty ammunition boxes, the debris of arrival. At the higher command levels, information was fragmentary and often contradictory. Reports arriving at headquarters mixed genuine progress with confusion and alarm in proportions that were difficult to untangle. General Patton, watching the operation from offshore, was receiving a picture of events that was hours behind reality on the ground. The nature of amphibious warfare in 1943, before the sophisticated communications technologies of later eras, meant that commanders at the top had to make decisions based on incomplete and often stale information, trusting subordinates and the logic of the plan to carry events forward in the gaps between reliable reports. It was an exercise in managed uncertainty, and the degree to which it was managed well or poorly would become clearer only as the day advanced. The air forces played their own complicated role in the opening hours. Allied fighter cover attempted to shield the fleet and the beaches from the Luftwaffe with varying degrees of success. German aircraft made repeated passes, targeting ships and landing craft, and anti-aircraft fire from the fleet rose in crackling walls to meet them. The coordination between ground forces and air support was imperfect, a problem that the Allied air commanders and ground commanders had debated sharply in the planning phase and would debate sharply again before the campaign was finished. But the overall weight of Allied air superiority prevented the kind of sustained air attack that might have turned the beaches into something entirely different. The Axis air forces were present, aggressive in moments, and ultimately insufficient. As the afternoon of the 10th stretched on and the beachheads stabilized, the scale of what had been accomplished began to come into focus. Allied forces had put more than 150,000 troops ashore across Sicily's southern coast in a single day, an operational achievement that required the convergence of months of planning, enormous industrial output, and the willingness of soldiers to step into the unknown at a signal from above. The cost had not been small. Men had been lost on the water, in the gliders, on the beaches, and in the fighting inland. The airborne drops in particular had exacted a price that would prompt painful assessments in the days that followed, but the lodgment existed. The island had been entered, and from those first thin strips of Allied-held ground, the next phase of the campaign, the one that would drive north, west, and east across Sicily, and that would place Messina at the center of an intensifying rivalry, was already beginning to take its shape. The night sky over the Mediterranean was supposed to be friendly. Transport aircraft carrying American paratroopers had filed their flight corridors, and the naval and ground forces below had been briefed on the routes those aircraft would take. What followed in the darkness of the 10th and 11th of July 1943 was one of the most devastating self-inflicted wounds the American military would suffer in the entire Sicilian campaign, not at the hands of the enemy, but through the catastrophic collision of poor coordination, frayed nerves, and the fog of a battle already 3 days old by the time the second wave of paratroopers lifted off from North Africa. The airborne concept itself was still young. American commanders had committed significant faith and resources to the idea that trained parachutists could drop behind enemy lines, seize critical objectives, and hold them long enough for seaborne forces to link up and push inland. The 82nd Airborne Division had proven its worth in theory and limited practice, and the men who boarded their transport aircraft in Tunisia carried with them the confidence of elite soldiers who believed in their mission. What they could not have prepared for was the lethal confusion waiting for them somewhere over the dark waters of the Mediterranean and the beaches of southern Sicily. The first wave of American paratroopers had already dropped during the early hours of the invasion, and that operation had been ragged enough on its own. High winds scattered the men across an area many times larger than the intended drop zone. Some paratroopers landed miles from their objectives. Small groups fought isolated actions in the Sicilian countryside through the night, doing enough damage to Axis communications and rear areas to claim a degree of operational usefulness, even if the cohesive seizure of key terrain had largely eluded them. By the time the second lift was ordered, The beaches were alive with the anxiety that comes from 2 days of landings, German counterattacks, and nerves stretched to breaking point. Every anti-aircraft crew along the coast had already been shooting at real enemy aircraft. The sound of airplane engines in the dark now carried a very different weight than it had in training. The critical failure was one of coordination, or rather, of coordination that existed on paper but had not translated reliably into the field. The transport aircraft carrying the second wave of the 82nd Airborne flew their pre-briefed corridors directly over the beachhead, and the Allied fleet anchored offshore. Anti-aircraft gunners on those ships and on the beaches had been under attack from Axis bombers only hours before. When the formation of transport aircraft appeared overhead in the darkness, the first guns opened fire. What happened next spread like a reflex along miles of coastline. Crew after crew, battery after battery, adding their fire to what some gunners believed was another enemy air raid. Within minutes, the sky over the fleet was filled with tracer rounds, shell bursts, and the terrible sound of aircraft being torn apart. The men inside those aircraft had no warning that would save them. Some transports took hits immediately and went down into the sea. Others managed to hold altitude long enough for some paratroopers to jump before the aircraft became uncontrollable. Many of those who did jump descended into water rather than land, weighed down by equipment, struggling in darkness against the Mediterranean's indifference. Crews that survived long enough to reach the Sicilian coast often found themselves scattered across terrain that bore little resemblance to their briefed objectives, their units broken apart by the violence of the flight in, their radios lost or damaged. The paratroopers who lived through the drop found themselves alone or in tiny groups, disoriented, often wounded, and without the massed strength that airborne operations depended upon to succeed. The losses were severe. Across the 2 nights of airborne operations, American forces suffered casualties that came not from Wehrmacht rifles or German armor, but from the guns of their own side. Aircraft were lost. Soldiers were killed or drowned. The numbers that filtered back through channels in the days following were grim enough to shock commanders who understood that a degree of confusion was built into any large amphibious assault. This was something different. This was the kind of loss that demands accounting, and everyone involved understood that the accounting would be uncomfortable. The immediate effect on morale was complex rather than simple. Paratroopers are selected and trained to endure chaos, and the men who survived the drops and reached the ground continued to fight, harassing Axis columns, cutting communications, appearing in unexpected places behind enemy lines in the manner that airborne doctrine promised they would. Their individual courage was not diminished by what had happened to them, but the knowledge spread quickly through American units that something had gone terribly wrong, that the friendly fire had been real, and that men had died not in the assault on an enemy position, but in the approach to one. That knowledge carries a particular kind of weight, one that does not dissolve easily in the days that follow. General Patton, whose 7th Army owned the American portion of the operation, was furious. The losses were a blow to his force and a challenge to his authority over a campaign he intended to prosecute with speed and aggression. He demanded explanations and investigations, pushing through channels to understand how the coordination had failed so completely. What he found was a system under enormous stress, naval commanders responding to genuine aerial threats, ground commanders who had issued warnings about the transport routes but whose warnings had not reached every crew, and the accumulated tension of a multi-day assault that had already seen real enemy air attacks against the fleet. Fault was distributed broadly enough that no single man could carry it alone, which perhaps made the whole episode more rather than less frustrating to a commander like Patton, who preferred clear lines of responsibility. The immediate operational response was swift and practical, in the way that military organizations under pressure often find clarity they could not achieve in preparation. Airborne operations for the remainder of the Sicilian campaign were restructured with a level of coordination that the initial planning had assumed but not enforced. Communication between air, sea, and ground commanders was tightened. Flight corridors were more rigorously deconflicted from the positions of anti-aircraft weapons. Procedures were introduced to ensure that naval and ground gunners received reliable, timely notice when friendly aircraft would be in their airspace. None of these fixes erased what had happened, but they reflected the American military's capacity to absorb a painful lesson and change its behavior, a characteristic that would matter enormously as the war grew larger and more complex in the years ahead. The tragedy also forced a broader reckoning with the state of airborne doctrine itself. The two American drops had demonstrated that the promise of mass parachute assaults, of thousands of trained men descending together onto a precise objective, was far more difficult to achieve in practice than the planning maps suggested. Wind, darkness, navigational error, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining formation over long overwater flights meant that paratroopers arrived scattered, their combat power diluted across miles of countryside. The men fought brilliantly as individuals and in small groups, but the concentrated blow that airborne theory promised had not materialized. Senior commanders took note. The debate over how and when to use airborne forces, a debate that would continue through Normandy and beyond, had found in Sicily some of its most important early evidence. For the paratroopers themselves, the experience left something that does not appear in after-action reports or casualty tallies. They had endured something that soldiers rarely discuss openly, the knowledge that the danger had come from the wrong direction. The men who jumped into Sicily and survived its opening chaos carried that knowledge with them through the rest of the campaign, through the grinding advance northward, through the delaying actions the Germans mounted as they prepared their eventual withdrawal. They fought alongside the infantrymen and armor of Patton's army as it gathered speed and momentum, their airborne distinction somewhat blurred by the realities of a campaign that had ground them down in ways not envisioned during training. But the capacity to absorb catastrophe and continue, to take a devastating blow on the very first night and still push forward, was itself a kind of proof that the soldiers Patton was leading were capable of something the early chaos had not been able to extinguish. Sicily would eventually fall. The campaign had barely completed its opening act when the airborne disaster unfolded, and the weeks of fighting still ahead would test American forces in ways the beaches and the night sky had only begun to suggest. But the lesson of those first terrible hours hung over every subsequent airborne planning session, every flight corridor brief, every signal exchanged between the men controlling the guns and the men flying the aircraft. The cost of coordination failures had been written into the ground and the sea off Sicily's southern coast, in a language no one who witnessed it would easily forget. Whatever came next, the drives westward and northward, the race toward Messina, the collision of ambitions between commanders who answered to the same flag but answered very differently to history, it would be conducted in the shroud of this knowledge. The Americans had learned something in the worst possible classroom. Now they had a campaign to fight. The sun rose on the 11th of July 1943 over a vastly different Sicily than the one that had greeted the Allied assault 24 hours earlier. Across the island's southern coast, from the American landing zones near Gela in the east to the British and Canadian beachheads in the southeast, thousands of soldiers had dug in, established perimeters, and begun the grinding work of consolidation. The initial chaos of the amphibious landings had given way to something more methodical and purposeful, the creation of secure lodgements from which a larger campaign could unfold. The airborne debacle of the previous night had shaken confidence, but it had not broken the momentum of the ground assault. By dawn, American commanders at corps and division level had begun to understand a critical truth. The Axis defenders of Sicily were neither as numerous nor as well coordinated as pre-invasion intelligence had suggested. What emerged in those first 72 hours was a campaign that would move far faster than anyone in the Allied chain of command had dared anticipate. The consolidation phase began with the prosaic but essential work of logistics. Supplies landed on Sicilian beaches. Ammunition, fuel, rations, medical equipment, and replacement personnel flowed from Navy transport vessels through the surf and onto sandy and rocky shores where quartermaster troops and combat engineers worked in coordinated chaos. Ships had to be unloaded swiftly to make room for the next wave of cargo vessels and assault craft. Air superiority, secured through the sacrifices of American and British fighters in the weeks before invasion, meant that German and Italian aircraft posed no serious threat to these unloading operations, though Axis artillery occasionally registered fire on the beachheads. The establishment of supply dumps inland, protected from naval gunfire, became the first major engineering challenge. Bulldozers carved roads through olive groves and wheat fields. Signalers strung communication wire. Medical stations were established in buildings that, hours before, had housed Italian soldiers or frightened civilians. The machinery of an invasion, invisible to those on the front lines, but absolutely vital to their survival and effectiveness, ground into motion across the beachhead perimeter. The American 7th Army, under General Patton's command, held the western sector of the invasion area, with landings near Licata and inland toward Gela. By the morning of the 11th, 3 divisions were ashore and expanding their beachhead against scattered but sometimes determined opposition. The 1st Infantry Division, hardened by months of fighting in North Africa, pushed inland from near Gela with steady purpose. The 45th Infantry Division, new to combat and commanded by Major General Troy Middleton, advanced rapidly through terrain that grew increasingly favorable to mobile warfare. The 3rd Infantry Division, under Major General Lucian Truscott, drove westward across relatively open ground toward airfields and supply concentrations. In each sector, advance guards encountered Italian and German troops in defensive positions. Pillboxes, anti-tank guns, prepared strongpoints. But these resistance points were small, often manned by exhausted or demoralized soldiers, and usually fell to concentrated fire and coordinated flanking attacks. American artillery, now coming ashore in volume, proved devastatingly effective against enemy positions that lacked depth or sophisticated fortifications. Tank units, having achieved beach exits without major opposition, began to move inland in organized columns, providing fire support and exploitation capability to the infantry advancing ahead of them. The British and Canadian forces in the southeast, under General Montgomery's 8th Army, faced a different tactical situation, but achieved comparable results. The invasion of Syracuse had been met with surrender rather than sustained combat, allowing British forces to consolidate and expand their beachhead rapidly. Canadian forces pushed north from their landing zones, extending the perimeter and securing villages and defensive positions with steady pressure. The eastern coast of Sicily, where these forces operated, offered more restrictive terrain than the American sector. Narrower coastal plains, higher ground closer to the sea, and a geography that favored defenders who chose to make a stand. Yet even here, Axis resistance proved sporadic and often half-hearted. Local Italian commanders surrendered towns after token resistance or none at all. German units, though more determined fighters, lacked the numbers and coordination to establish a continuous defensive line. What became clear to every commander, whether American or British, was that Sicily's defense had been constructed on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. The invaders had expected to fight a disciplined and cohesive Axis force. What they encountered instead was a fragmented defense where Italian units frequently collapsed when pressed, and German formations struggled to mount coordinated counterattacks without reliable intelligence, adequate reserves, or clear communication with higher headquarters. The human dimension of consolidation played out in thousands of small moments that rarely made it into official reports or historical accounts. Infantrymen dug foxholes in the rocky ground, their entrenching tools striking stone again and again. Young soldiers, many seeing combat for the first time, discovered that the reality of warfare bore little resemblance to the training films and the confident briefings they had received in North Africa. The smell of cordite mixed with the dust kicked up by truck movements and the sweet-sour smell of sweat and unwashed bodies. Medics treated wounds both serious and minor in aid stations and field hospitals hastily established in captured buildings. Engineers cleared mines from roads and beaches, a painstaking task that required patience and nerves of steel. Quartermaster troops established ammunition supply points and fuel caches. Signals troops strung wire and erected radio antennas. The cooks, working in improvised kitchens, prepared hot meals for men who had subsisted on rations for days. And throughout the beachhead, prisoners of war began to accumulate, Italians mostly, some appearing almost relieved to be out of the fight, along with a smaller number of German soldiers captured in sharp firefights or during the confusion of rapid advances. The prisoner holding areas, hastily constructed compounds of barbed wire and guard posts, became another feature of the consolidation landscape. Intelligence officers, working from captured documents and interrogation of prisoners, began to paint a picture of the Axis defensive situation that grew increasingly clear as the hours passed. The Italian Sixth Army, nominally defending Sicily, had been undermanned and poorly supplied even before the invasion. The arrival of the Seventh Army in North Africa had stretched Axis resources even thinner. German units on the island, primarily elements of the Hermann Göring Division and other formation fragments, numbered far fewer than Allied intelligence analysts had feared. The German commander on Sicily, General Alfredo Guzzoni, lacked the reserves, the air support, or the clear strategic direction necessary to coordinate a defense against an enemy that had achieved local air superiority and numerical advantage in the landing zones. Italian commanders, moreover, were increasingly unreliable. Some units fought, but their hearts were not in the struggle. The Italian government, its people exhausted by years of war and the relentless bombing campaign that had devastated Italian cities, seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse. Sicily, from the perspective of the soldiers who defended it, appeared to many as a dying cause. Prisoners told their interrogators that they had been ordered to hold positions but given no indication of where reserves would come from or what the larger strategy might be. The Axis defenders of Sicily were not cowards. Many fought with courage and skill, but they were abandoned men fighting without coherent direction or realistic hope of success. The pushing inland progressed with remarkable speed. The 1st Infantry Division advanced past Gela and pushed northward into terrain that became progressively more open as the American forces moved away from the coastal plain. The 45th Infantry Division drove westward across the island's interior, covering tens of kilometers in a single day once initial resistance had been overcome. German attempts to organize counterattacks proved half-hearted or poorly coordinated. At Gela itself, German forces mounted what appeared to be a serious effort to push back the American beachhead, but the assault was broken up by artillery fire and American infantry fighting from prepared positions. After this engagement, German commanders seemed to lose the initiative. They retreated eastward and then northward, attempting to establish new defensive positions but lacking the strength to hold them for long. Italian units, encountering determined American resistance, often simply withdrew or surrendered rather than press the fight. By the 12th of July, American forces held a continuous perimeter, extending inland from the coast for a depth of perhaps 20 kilometers in some sectors. Similar gains had been achieved in the British sector, though the terrain there proved somewhat more constraining. The notion that this campaign would grind forward for weeks or months began to seem increasingly improbable. The psychological shift among the invaders occurred gradually but distinctly across these first 3 days. The soldiers who had crossed the Mediterranean with genuine uncertainty about the reception they would receive, knowing from intelligence briefings that Sicily was defended and that beaches could be killing grounds, began to realize that the anticipated desperate defense was not materializing. Casualties, while significant in certain engagements, were far below the estimates that planners had used for supply calculations and replacement projections. Officers found that their men grew steadier and more confident with each successful advance. The fear that had animated the first hours ashore, the primal fear of the amphibious soldier, caught between the enemy ahead and the sea behind, gave way to the different emotions of pursuit. Men who had huddled behind obstacles on the beach the day before now moved forward with a sense of momentum. The news filtered through the ranks that the enemy was falling back, that towns were being liberated, that progress was being made. The morale boost proved intangible but real. Soldiers who had been trained to expect a tough, grinding campaign began to sense that the Sicilian campaign might prove far shorter than anyone had predicted. This perception, accurate as it turned out, altered the psychological dynamic of the entire operation. Friction between the commanders began to emerge even during this consolidation phase, though it remained muted compared to what would develop in the coming days. Patton, commanding the American 7th Army, was receiving reports from his advancing divisions that suggested the western portion of Sicily was less heavily defended than the eastern sector. Montgomery, commanding the British 8th Army, was advancing more slowly against somewhat stiffer resistance in his sector. The respective commanders began to consider how to exploit the weakness they perceived. Montgomery advocated for a plan that would see his forces drive northward to secure airfields and then wheel eastward toward the strategic prize of Messina, the city that controlled the strait separating Sicily from mainland Italy. Patton, watching his forces advance rapidly westward and northwestward, began to envision an alternative strategy, a rapid push across the western portion of Sicily toward the northern coast, followed by a swing eastward that would carry his forces toward Messina from the north. These were not yet sources of open conflict between the commanders. Allied headquarters remained focused on consolidation and ensuring that the beachheads remained secure. But the seeds of disagreement had been planted. Two generals, each convinced of the excellence of his own troops and the soundness of his own military judgment, had begun to develop divergent views about the campaign's next phase. The reality of how completely the Axis defense had collapsed became starkly apparent by the 13th of July. A major reorganization of the invasion forces took place on this date, with American and British commands formally assuming control of their assigned sectors. The initial uncertainty about whether reserves existed somewhere in the Sicilian interior that might launch devastating counterattacks gave way to confidence that no such reserves would materialize. Captured Sicilian towns provided depots of supplies and defensive positions that could be developed into strongpoints. Most importantly, the airfields that dotted southern Sicily fell into Allied hands largely intact, allowing Allied air forces to establish forward operating bases that extended their range and endurance. The tempo of the campaign accelerated as a result, with air superiority now anchored to Sicilian bases, with beachheads expanding daily, with supply operations running smoothly, and with the enemy seemingly unable to mount any serious resistance. The psychological transition from an amphibious assault focused on consolidation to a pursuit focused on destroying the enemy became possible. The invaders had not simply gained a foothold on Sicily. They had accomplished the most difficult phase of amphibious warfare. They had crossed the beaches, overcome initial resistance, and established lodgements secure enough and large enough to begin mobile operations. The Sicily campaign was no longer a question of whether the Allies could hold the island. It had become a question of how quickly they could seize it. The logistics of consolidation proved every bit as important as the combat operations themselves, though it received less dramatic attention. Supply lines stretching back across the Mediterranean through Malta and North Africa had to function flawlessly to sustain an invasion force of well over 100,000 men in the first weeks ashore. Naval gunfire support, coordinated with artillery positions being established inland, created a protective bubble around the beachheads. Air cover, maintained by squadrons of American and British fighters flying from North African bases and soon from captured Sicilian airfields, prevented Axis air attacks from disrupting supply operations. The establishment of forward airfields became a priority for both commands. Within days of the landings, engineers and aviation personnel were working to repair or improve captured airfields, allowing fighter squadrons to relocate to Sicily and assume permanent positions covering the beachheads. The shift of air operations to the island marked a crucial turning point in the campaign. It meant that the Allies no longer depended on North African bases for air support. It meant that fighter cover could be maintained over the operational area almost continuously. It meant that German and Italian aircraft, already outnumbered and operating from inferior bases, faced an even more daunting situation. The treatment of the Sicilian population during consolidation revealed both the professionalism of Allied forces and the genuine liberation that the invasion represented for many islanders. The American and British soldiers who entered Sicilian towns were generally disciplined despite the stress of combat. Military government detachments, established as part of the invasion plan, began assuming administrative control of captured areas. Food was distributed to civilians whose stores had been depleted by war and occupation. Repairs were made to public infrastructure damaged by the bombing campaigns that had preceded the invasion. Most significantly, the presence of the Allies meant that Sicilians were no longer under Axis rule. For many, this represented genuine liberation. The German and Italian troops were seen as occupiers in all but name, and their withdrawal under pressure from American and British forces was welcomed by a population exhausted by years of war. This popular reception, though not overwhelming, Sicilians were understandably cautious about new arrivals, nonetheless provided the Allies with a psychological advantage. They were not being resisted by a population defending their homeland against foreign invaders. They were being, in many cases, accepted as liberators. This fundamental reality shaped the entire character of the consolidation phase. It meant that operations could proceed without rear area security concerns. It meant that captured towns could be occupied with minimal garrison requirements. It meant that the Allies could focus their efforts on defeating the Axis military forces rather than pacifying a hostile population. By the end of the fourth day after the invasion, the reality had become unmistakable to every commander at every level. The beachhead was secure. The guns had quieted, and in the space between the operational maps and the commander's quarters, two men were beginning to imagine different futures for Sicily. Bernard Montgomery stood before his charts and saw what he had always seen, the methodical way. His Eighth Army would advance up the eastern coast of Sicily, methodically pressing toward Catania and eventually toward Messina. It was the classic pattern, the approach that had worked in North Africa, the strategy that emphasized mass, preparation, and the deliberate crushing of enemy resistance. The terrain on Sicily's eastern flank was difficult, yes. The Germans and Italians would resist more fiercely there. But this was how wars were won, through discipline, through concentration of force, through the relentless accumulation of advantages until the enemy had no choice but to break. Montgomery's vision was one of inevitability. The Eighth Army would drive forward like a piston, and Messina would fall because it had to. General George Patton Jr. saw something different entirely. While Montgomery's forces were meeting stiffening resistance around Catania, Patton had begun to recognize a void on the western and central portions of the island. The Axis defenders had funneled most of their strength toward the east, had concentrated their hopes on holding the high ground and the ports that Montgomery threatened. But Sicily's interior and its northwestern reaches were lightly held. Patton's intelligence officers and reconnaissance units were reporting weakness, confusion, and demoralization among the scattered German and Italian formations in those sectors. What Patton saw was not just an opportunity, but a possibility so audacious it seemed almost reckless. A rapid drive westward across the interior of the island, followed by a wheeling northward toward Messina. If this maneuver succeeded, it would not merely outflank Montgomery, it would encircle the entire Axis position, trap their forces between the two Allied armies, and potentially shorten the entire campaign by weeks. The difference between these two visions was not merely strategic, it was temperamental. Montgomery had built his reputation on caution redeemed by certainty, on the slow accumulation of overwhelming force that made defeat impossible. He had fought across North Africa with this method, had driven Rommel back through methodical persistence, and he believed it had vindicated him. Montgomery was 55 years old, a career soldier who had learned his trade in the trenches of the First World War and had refined it through decades of regimented thinking. Patton, by contrast, was 57 but had never fully shed the aggression of youth. His entire military philosophy rested on momentum, on the exploitation of fleeting opportunity, on the audacious stroke that paralyzed the enemy's will to resist. Where Montgomery saw risk in rapid movement, Patton saw greater risk in hesitation. By the middle of the second week of July, Patton had begun moving aggressively to execute his vision. He repositioned his forces, allocated resources toward the western and central avenues of advance, and issued orders that reflected not caution but urgency. The American 47th Infantry Division, under General Troy Middleton, began driving westward across the interior of the island. Behind them and in parallel, other formations pressed forward, their supply lines stretched, but their purpose crystalline. Patton's radio reports and dispatches began to convey a new theme. The opportunity was real, the enemy was wavering, and the moment required decisiveness. To his subordinates, he radiated confidence. To his equals and superiors, he projected a vision that was rapidly becoming unmistakable. Patton intended to race Montgomery to Messina, and he intended to win. This was when the professional friction began to harden into something more personal. Montgomery had not initially understood the full scope of what Patton was proposing. The operational orders from 15th Army Group headquarters, under Alexander, had emphasized that both armies should advance toward Messina, but the language had been somewhat ambiguous about priority and method. Montgomery had assumed a leisurely pace, had planned his supply operations and logistics on the basis of a sustained push up the eastern coast. When the implications of Patton's movements became clear, that the American commander intended not merely to advance but to outmaneuver him, to claim Messina as an American prize, Montgomery's response was one of irritation mixed with something approaching contempt. He viewed Patton's approach as exactly what he found most objectionable: rash, improvised, dependent on luck rather than preparation. Montgomery made his reservations known through the chain of command, through signals to Alexander, and through private communications with members of the 15th Army Group staff. He argued that Patton's dispersed approach violated principles of concentration, that stretched supply lines would inevitably fail under the strain, that rapid movement across unfamiliar terrain in the face of a capable enemy was foolish gambling rather than generalship. Moreover, and this cut deeper into the personal rivalry, Montgomery suggested that American commanders lacked the patience and discipline that the conduct of modern warfare demanded. He had, after all, defeated Rommel when American forces under Dwight Eisenhower had been bested by him in North Africa. Montgomery's implicit argument was that he understood war better, thought more clearly, and should be trusted with the overall direction of the Sicily campaign. Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group, found himself in an extraordinarily delicate position. He was technically senior to both commanders, yet he served under Eisenhower and answered to political authorities in both London and Washington. The American public and political establishment were watching Patton closely. Here was an American general who embodied American aggression, American speed, American willingness to risk for dramatic gain. Montgomery, by contrast, was associated with British caution, British planning, British skepticism about American military capacity. An Alexander decision to rein in Patton and support Montgomery's measured approach would be viewed in Washington as evidence that American commanders were being subordinated to British strategy. Conversely, to give Patton his head was to risk exactly the kind of logistical catastrophe that Montgomery warned against, and to do so meant accepting that a British commander of considerable renown would be outpaced by an American rival. The command structure itself became a source of friction. The operational orders issued during the planning phases had granted considerable autonomy to both commanders within their respective sectors, but the race for Messina, implicit in Patton's vision, unspoken but increasingly obvious, created a practical ambiguity. Who would ultimately control the approach to Messina? Would it be Montgomery's 8th Army coming from the south, or Patton's forces coming from the west? And if both arrived simultaneously, who had the authority to enter the city first? These questions revealed a deeper problem. Sicily had been divided between two commanders, but Messina was the ultimate prize, and no one had clearly specified how this particular card would be played. What neither commander could fully articulate, but both understood viscerally, was that this campaign was being watched far beyond Sicily. In Washington and London, in the press corps, and among the public, the Sicily campaign was being constructed as a test of American versus British generalship. Montgomery had his admirers and his detractors. He was cautious, meticulous, admittedly sometimes ponderous, but he had defeated one of the war's most dangerous commanders, and had done so through discipline and planning. Patton was charismatic, aggressive, and embodied a particular vision of American military dynamism. The race for Messina would demonstrate which philosophy of warfare was superior, the methodical British approach or the dynamic American offensive. Neither general could ignore these larger currents. Patton's breakthrough vision was therefore not merely a tactical or operational concept. It was a statement about how warfare should be conducted, about the nature of American military capability, and about Patton's own place in the grand narrative of the Second World War. He had been in disgrace not long before, had been relegated to comparative obscurity after the slapping incident in North Africa. This was his moment of redemption, his opportunity to prove that American generals could think as boldly and act as decisively as anyone in the British Army. Every kilometre his forces covered westward, every town they liberated, every logistical challenge they overcame, was, to Patton, evidence that his vision was not reckless but far-sighted. By the final days of July, the parameters of the race had become impossible to ignore. Montgomery's Eighth Army was advancing more slowly than planned, encountering stronger German resistance around Catania, struggling with terrain and supply challenges along the eastern coast. Patton's American forces, by contrast, were moving with a speed that had begun to astonish even those who witnessed it daily. They were covering distances that seemed impossible given the state of the roads, the heat, the enemy action. Yet they advanced. The breakthrough vision was not remaining on the maps. It was becoming operational reality. The tension between the two commanders would only intensify as the campaign progressed, as the competitive element became undeniable, and as both men recognized that their entire legacy in this war might hinge on the race for a single city on Sicily's northern coast. Patton's vision of rapid, audacious maneuver was about to be tested against the stubborn realities of supply, terrain, and determined enemy resistance. But in those middle weeks of the Sicilian campaign, as he watched his forces drive deeper into the island's interior, Patton believed that boldness and vision could overcome any obstacle. The question that hung in the Mediterranean air was not whether he was right, but how brutally history would answer when the final kilometers had been covered and the race was decided. The Axis collapse that began on the beaches spread inland like a tide that could not be stopped. Within 48 hours of the landings, American commanders realized something extraordinary was unfolding. The enemy was not mounting a coordinated defense, but rather retreating in fragments, units scattered and demoralized. By the 11th of July, Patton's 7th Army had secured enough ground to establish a coherent beachhead, and the opportunities before him became suddenly, unmistakably clear. To the east, Montgomery faced stiffer resistance near Catania, where German forces had begun to consolidate. But to the west and north, Italian divisions were collapsing. German units were too few to hold a continuous line, and the roads into Sicily's interior lay essentially open. Patton saw something his superiors had not yet fully grasped: the chance to move with speed that would outpace not just the enemy, but his own ally. The race, though not yet declared, had begun. On the 12th of July, Patton issued orders that set the tone for everything that would follow. Instead of advancing methodically in a broad front, securing terrain as he went, he authorized a spear-like thrust westward and then northward. The 2nd Armored Division, under Major General Hugh J. Gaffey, would lead the way. Supporting infantry would follow as closely as supply lines allowed. The axis of advance pointed toward Gela on the southern coast, then inland toward Licata and the western reaches of the island. The objective was not merely to advance, but to cover ground with a speed that Sicily's poor roads and defensive terrain seemed to forbid. Patton understood that warfare at this scale depended on momentum. The enemy was reeling. The moment to exploit that reeling before German units could regroup or Italian forces could find their nerve, was now. He would not, he decided, let caution dictate the pace. The American columns that began rolling westward in the days following the landings represented something almost unprecedented in modern warfare. Tank companies, motorized infantry, support vehicles, and supply trucks stretched for miles along roads that had never been designed for such volume. Dust rose in clouds that could be seen from aircraft. The noise of diesel engines and tracked vehicles grinding through small towns announced their coming long before they arrived. Speed was not an accident of this advance, but its purpose. American tankers, many of them young men from farms and cities across the United States, who had spent weeks training in the North African heat, found themselves part of something that felt like momentum incarnate. They rolled past Italian villages where civilians stood in doorways, some hostile, some curious, many simply bewildered by the scale and confidence of the American presence. German prisoners were collected in increasing numbers, their faces showing a kind of resignation that spoke of armies already comprehending their fate. The resistance encountered varied wildly across the island's interior. In some sectors, scattered Italian units fired briefly before surrendering or melting away. In others, small groups of German soldiers mounted delaying actions, setting up hasty ambushes or destroying bridges to slow the American advance. But none of this was sufficient to halt the momentum. American artillery would open fire, aircraft would strafe the blocking positions, and the infantry would maneuver around the obstacle. The Germans, too few in number and lacking the fuel or mobility to execute a coordinated withdrawal, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that was not interested in fair fights, but in reaching Messina first. Casualties mounted, but not catastrophically. The American forces were learning the terrible mathematics of modern war, that victory often came not from matching an enemy in a single engagement, but from accepting small costs while moving so quickly that the enemy could never gather strength for a serious blow. Supply became the silent struggle behind this spectacular advance. Tanks consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Infantry units burned through ammunition in firefights and training exercises both. Food, water, medical supplies, replacement parts, all had to be hauled forward over roads that were often nothing more than tracks suitable for mule traffic. American logisticians, many of them serving far from the front lines, worked in brutal coordination to funnel resources forward. Supply sergeants became crucial figures in the success of the operation. Drivers piloting trucks along roads where German aircraft might appear at any moment knew that their cargoes meant the difference between an armored column that could continue advancing and one that would grind to a halt. The beaches where the invasion had begun became frenzied ports of operation, with ships being unloaded, cargo organized, and convoys assembled to move supplies inland. Every kilometer that Patton's forces advanced meant longer supply lines, more strain on the system, and greater risk that logistics alone would force a slowdown. But the Americans pressed forward, gambling that the enemy's collapse would be so complete that sustaining the advance would prove possible. By the middle of July, American forces had pushed across much of western Sicily, covering distances that astonished even the commanders ordering the advance. Agrigento fell on the 16th of July. Licata, on the southern coast, had already been secured. The road to Palermo, the island's largest city, and the prize that Patton had set before himself and his army, lay open. Patton's reputation was spreading through the ranks of the Seventh Army. Stories of his aggressive orders, his unwillingness to accept cautious counsel, his driving ambition to move faster than anyone thought possible. Some officers regarded him as the instrument of Seventh Army's success. a commander who understood that wars were won by armies that moved with intention and speed. Others worried that his aggressiveness would expose American forces to counterattack or stretch supply lines past the breaking point. But the results were undeniable. While Montgomery's advance in the east was grinding forward against stubborn German resistance and difficult terrain, Patton's armies were covering ground at a pace that seemed almost to defy the physical limitations of machinery and men. The psychological dimension of this advance rippled outward in ways that extended far beyond the immediate operational success. American soldiers, many of them serving in their first combat operation, began to acquire confidence. They had landed on hostile beaches and survived. They had driven an enemy that had seemed formidable just weeks earlier across an island like conquerors. The notion that American arms could move with such speed and decisiveness, that mechanized warfare could be wielded as an instrument of national will, took root in the consciousness of the army. Correspondents who had accompanied the invasion sent back stories of the 7th Army's dash across Sicily. Newspapers in the United States printed accounts of Patton's aggressive advance. The general himself, a man who understood the value of public perception as keenly as he understood tactics, cultivated an image of himself as the man driving the campaign forward. Whether this image was entirely accurate hardly mattered. Perception was its own kind of power, and Patton had always understood that. The roads themselves told the story of the advance. American signposts began appearing, crude affairs indicating direction and distance to towns that many of the soldiers had never heard of before coming to Sicily. Italian civilians began to understand that the Americans were not passing through, but establishing themselves. Small towns that had expected to see this campaign unfold over weeks found themselves suddenly behind the American lines, surrounded by soldiers, vehicles, and the apparatus of an advancing army. The Italian defenders of Sicily, already demoralized and fragmented, lost any hope of coordinated resistance. Garrisons that might have been expected to put up resistance simply surrendered. Officers recognized that prolonging the fight would only increase casualties without changing the outcome. What had seemed possible in the days of the invasion, a strong defensive campaign, inflicting losses on the Americans, perhaps forcing a negotiated settlement, had become impossible in less than 2 weeks. The relationship between Patton and his subordinate commanders during this advance reflected both the effectiveness of American command structure and Patton's particular genius for leveraging it. Unlike some armies where authority flowed strictly from top to bottom, the American system gave considerable latitude to divisional and regimental commanders to execute orders within the bounds of Patton's intentions. Patton's orders were clear: move fast, maintain contact with the enemy, do not allow German forces to regroup. Within those parameters, subordinates had flexibility. Some commanders pushed with aggressive vigor, driving their men forward relentlessly. Others took a more measured approach, ensuring supply lines remained intact and troops remained capable of fighting if serious resistance materialized. The result was an advance that was simultaneously rapid and resilient, fast without being reckless, ambitious without being suicidal. Yet beneath this success lay tensions that would soon become visible to higher command. Montgomery, watching the American advance from his sector, was beginning to recognize that the British campaign in the east would not decide Sicily's outcome. The speed of Patton's westward drive, the fall of towns that no one had predicted would fall so quickly, the evident capability of the American army to sustain rapid movement, all of this suggested that if there was to be a race for Messina, Patton was already winning it. At headquarters, commanders were beginning to recognize that the invasion had produced an unexpected dynamic. The plan had envisioned a campaign where American and British forces would advance in concert, roughly parallel, with the British in the primary role and the Americans in a supporting capacity. Instead, the Americans were threatening to outpace their allies and perhaps to dominate the campaign's concluding phase. This recognition would soon lead to contentious discussions about command authority, strategy, and the proper allocation of resources. The landscape itself was transforming as American forces advanced deeper into Sicily. The beaches where soldiers had landed just days earlier were becoming rear areas, zones of consolidation and supply rather than combat. The front lines were racing forward, now almost to the western edge of the island. Towns that had been enemy positions a few days earlier now hosted American command posts and supply depots. The road network, primitive as it was, had been seized and was being utilized by American forces with increasing sophistication. Italian soldiers who had been captured or had surrendered were being collected in improvised prison camps, waiting for eventual transport off the island. The Sicilian civilians were adjusting to occupation by an American army that, whatever its ultimate intentions, was not the Nazi regime that had occupied them for so long. This process of rapid transition from combat to consolidation, repeated across the island, represented warfare operating at the velocity that Patton had envisioned. As the month of July wore on and American forces drove ever closer to Palermo, the implications of the advance became undeniable. Patton had seized the operational initiative through aggressive action, through a willingness to move faster than prudence might ordinarily allow, and through his intuitive understanding of how to exploit an enemy that had lost cohesion. The Axis forces in Sicily, lacking the mobility and the numbers to mount a sustained defense against an enemy moving at such speed, were being driven back piecemeal. Montgomery's measured advance against stiffer resistance in the east was achieving successes, but those successes were incremental compared to the spectacular gains Patton was posting in the west. The race for Messina, whatever anyone in higher command might officially say about coordination and unified strategy, was beginning to reveal itself through these kilometers of conquered territory. The American Seventh Army, under a general who had never doubted that speed was the ultimate military virtue, was demonstrating that doctrine on Sicilian roads. The question that remained was whether the momentum could be sustained all the way to the island's northern coast, and whether Patton's ambitions would be channeled toward the strategic objective or would instead create friction with his British superior and his own headquarters. But for now, in the heat of July and the dust of advancing columns, American armor rolled forward, and the commander who had gambled on speed found that his gamble was paying dividends measured in kilometers gained and enemy forces scattered. By the 22nd of July 1943, the Sicilian campaign had begun to reveal a truth that no amount of planning could have fully anticipated. On paper, the invasion scheme bore the marks of careful compromise. General Alexander, commanding the overall operation, had divided the island between British Eighth Army under Montgomery on the east and American Seventh Army under Patton on the west. The division seemed logical. The British would pursue the direct route up the eastern coast toward Messina, while the Americans would secure the western and central portions of the island. But as the first fortnight of fighting unfolded, the assumptions underlying this plan began to unravel like old fabric, and with it came tensions that would define not just a campaign, but the relationship between two men whose ambitions had begun to collide in ways neither headquarters nor superiors could have easily foreseen. Montgomery faced a problem that was partly geographical, partly tactical, and entirely frustrating. The eastern approach to Messina, which he had anticipated would be the quickest route, proved to be neither quick nor uncontested. Catania, the prize objective that lay in his path, sat on the coastal plain surrounded by defensive positions that the Germans had prepared with deliberate care. Unlike the scattered and disorganized Italian units that crumbled before Patton's advance inland, the German forces opposing Montgomery's approach maintained cohesion and discipline. The terrain itself, narrower roads, more defensible positions, the opportunities for artillery concentration, favored the defender. By late July, Montgomery's progress had begun to slow to a crawl, and worse, his original plan to swing inland and encircle Catania from the north was becoming increasingly difficult as German resistance stiffened and American forces, operating to his west, were beginning to move with an entirely different rhythm. Patton, meanwhile, was operating in an entirely different war. His westward drive had encountered crumbling opposition, disorganized Italian units more interested in surrender than resistance, and increasingly, he discovered something more valuable than any enemy strength report: opportunity. The American Seventh Army, spreading across the interior of Sicily, faced minimal opposition and vast possibilities. Patton's instinct for mobile warfare, his appetite for rapid exploitation, his willingness to take calculated risks that made conventional planners nervous, all of this aligned perfectly with the situation unfolding before him. By the end of the third week, Patton had begun to perceive not just the possibility, but the necessity of a different strategy. Rather than wait for Montgomery to inch forward toward Messina, why not swing north, seize Sicily's northern coast, and then drive east toward Messina himself? The audacity of the idea was matched only by its operational logic. His forces were moving faster, facing lighter opposition, and the axis of advance northward and then eastward offered the real possibility of reaching Sicily's northeastern corner before Montgomery could bludgeon his way through the Catania defenses. The problem, of course, was that this vision directly contradicted the operational plan that had been agreed upon at the highest levels. Montgomery remained the senior field commander in Alexander's view, and the original scheme had assigned the main effort toward Messina to the British Eighth Army. But Patton began to make a case, first carefully to his own staff, and then more persistently through the chain of command, that the situation had changed. The facts on the ground suggested a different approach. Axis resistance was crumbling faster in the west and center than in the east. American forces had demonstrated an ability to move with speed and coordination that was exceeding initial expectations. The road north from Gela existed, and with it came the possibility of a northern route to Messina that might prove far quicker than hammering through German positions around Catania. What Patton was proposing was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was a fundamental reconception of how the island would be conquered and who would reach Messina first. The conversations between headquarters, filtered through messages and occasional conferences, took on an increasingly tense character. Montgomery, from his perspective, was following the original plan precisely as he understood it. The fact that his advance was slower than anticipated reflected enemy resistance, not poor generalship or lack of vigor. He had no intention of stepping aside or reorienting his approach simply because an American commander wanted to chase a prize that Montgomery considered already assigned to his command. The tension was not born of any single dramatic confrontation, but rather from a fundamental incompatibility of views about what the campaign required, and, perhaps more honestly, about which commander deserved the distinction of capturing Messina. Montgomery believed in methodical, coordinated operations, with firepower concentrated and risks minimized. Patton believed in exploitation, audacity, and the willingness to accept risk to achieve decisive results. These were not merely different tactical philosophies, they were different visions of what modern warfare should look like, and they had found themselves in direct competition. Alexander, sitting above both men, faced a choice that was as much political as it was military. The American contingent in the Mediterranean, the political establishment back in Washington, had begun to take notice of Patton's rapid advance and growing confidence. The newspapers at home were beginning to carry stories of American daring and success, and there was in those dispatches a faint suggestion that perhaps American soldiers and American commanders were beginning to prove themselves equal or superior to their British counterparts. This was not merely a tactical consideration. The entire alliance rested upon an assumption of rough equality between American and British commands, and on an understanding that strategic decisions would reflect the political reality that Britain and America had fought together since 1941. But if American forces under Patton were now demonstrating superior mobility, superior aggressiveness, and superior results, then the balance of the alliance itself might be shifting. Alexander was aware of this dimension in a way that neither Patton nor Montgomery could fully appreciate from their tactical positions. He was responsible not merely for winning Sicily, but for maintaining the cohesion of the entire Anglo-American enterprise. By the last week of July, the friction had become impossible to ignore. Patton had begun to issue orders to his subordinates, suggesting that 7th Army would pursue operations toward Messina along the northern axis. These were carefully worded so as not to directly contradict Alexander's authority, but they signaled clearly enough where Patton's intentions lay. Montgomery, informed of these movements, began to push back through channels, insisting that American forces should remain in a supporting role while 8th Army completed the main operation. The tone of these exchanges, at first professional and decorous, began to carry an edge. Professional disagreement was becoming something else. It was becoming personal. Patton, in his journals and his conversations with subordinates, began to characterize Montgomery as overly cautious, hidebound by convention, unwilling to accept the flexibility that modern warfare demanded. Montgomery, for his part, viewed Patton as reckless, insubordinate, operating outside the bounds of agreed-upon operational planning. Each man, in his own mind, had become convinced that the other was either incompetent or worse, was willing to sacrifice military effectiveness for personal glory. The senior commanders above both men were watching this dynamic with varying degrees of concern and awareness. General Eisenhower, the overall supreme commander of Allied forces in North Africa and Europe, was not directly involved in day-to-day operations in Sicily, but was receiving reports of the growing tension. The British members of the command structure, particularly in London, had strong opinions about Montgomery and his relationship to American commanders. There was, among some British officers, a sense that Montgomery deserved deference as the senior field commander, and that Patton, though talented, should remain subordinate. But there was equally a growing awareness that the Americans had brought enormous resources to the Mediterranean, and that American commanders were not going to accept indefinite subordination to British authority, no matter how senior. The careful balance that had been established in the initial planning was beginning to show signs of stress that no one had fully anticipated. The resource question added another layer of complexity to the growing tension. Both armies required ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and reinforcements. The supply pipeline running across Sicily from the beaches to the forward units was finite. Decisions about which units received priority for ammunition, fuel, and transport had to be made constantly, and those decisions implicitly reflected judgments about operational priorities. When American forces began to receive additional allocations of fuel to support their northward advance, British officers noted it and saw it as a signal that Alexander, despite his careful statements about Montgomery remaining the senior commander, was actually beginning to shift resources towards supporting Patton's offensive northward. Every decision about supply, every allocation of motor transport, every diversion of air support from one sector to another became read as a signal about whose operational vision was winning favor at headquarters. In this environment, professional calculation and personal rivalry became increasingly difficult to separate. What made the situation particularly delicate was that neither Patton nor Montgomery could be dismissed as merely ambitious or merely difficult. Both men were genuine soldiers who had thought deeply about warfare, and both had demonstrated capabilities that warranted respect. Montgomery had proven himself a capable commander in North Africa, breaking Rommel's offensive and establishing himself as a general who understood desert warfare and could coordinate large formations effectively. Patton had demonstrated leadership, vision, and an ability to inspire troops that was recognized even by his critics. The issue was not that one man was right and the other was wrong. The issue was that they represented genuinely different approaches to warfare, and the circumstances in Sicily had created a situation where those different approaches were now in direct competition for the same prize. The tension was not a failure of leadership or a sign of personal weakness. It was an almost inevitable consequence of placing two strong-willed commanders with genuine differences of philosophy in a situation where their operational areas and their objectives had begun to overlap. As the month of July drew to a close, both commanders were essentially operating as though their interpretations of the orders from above were the correct ones. Patton was preparing for a major northward push, convinced that this was where the real opportunity lay and that his force was best positioned to exploit it. Montgomery was continuing to hammer against Catania, convinced that whatever alternative schemes his American colleague might be contemplating, the original plan remained the right one and would ultimately vindicate itself. Alexander, back at headquarters, was receiving conflicting reports, demands for clarification, and increasingly pointed arguments about strategy and authority. The delicate balance that had been established in the initial planning for Operation Husky was coming under stress that would force a reckoning in the form of explicit operational decisions about who would do what and where the main effort would be directed. The next days would determine not just who reached Messina first, but what the victory would mean for the alliance, for future campaigns, and for the two commanders whose rivalry had become the defining subtext of the Sicily campaign. The beachhead at Gela lay exposed and vulnerable in those first days of July 1943. American forces had secured the town itself and pushed inland to a depth of perhaps 5 kilometers, but the perimeter remained shallow, stretched thin across unfamiliar terrain where Axis forces still held organized positions in the hills beyond. Supply lines ran back to the beaches where naval vessels anchored offshore, ready to provide gunfire support, but also acutely aware that they themselves were within range of Axis aircraft and artillery. The men dug in around Gela understood the precarious nature of their position. They had come ashore with enough ammunition and rations for a few days of fighting, but reinforcements and heavy equipment were still flowing across the beaches in a carefully managed sequence, until the beachhead expanded and deepened, until airfields could be captured and secured, until supply dumps grew large enough to sustain rapid offensive operations. The American forces at Gela remained dependent on the sufferance of their still mobile enemies. It was precisely this window of vulnerability that the Axis commanders recognized, and they moved to exploit it with what remained of their military capability. General Alfredo Guzzoni, the Italian commander of all forces on Sicily, understood that the initial surprise had faded and that the Axis forces must act decisively or face being overrun by the weight of American and British resources flowing into the island. He began concentrating every available unit, Italian divisions that still possessed some cohesion, German panzer elements that had proven their worth in earlier campaigns, and motorized units that could move with sufficient speed to strike the American beachhead before it had fully consolidated. The German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, still commanding respect as a fighting formation, began moving toward Gela from the interior. These were professional soldiers with combat experience earned in North Africa and in the grinding campaigns of the Russian front. They knew how to execute a coordinated counterattack, and they brought with them the heavier weapons and armor that the Italian forces lacked. What unfolded in the days following the initial assault represented something between a desperate gamble and a calculated military operation. The Axis forces could not hope to drive the Americans back into the sea. The sheer disparity in resources and the command of the waters themselves made that impossible. But they could strike hard enough to disrupt the American consolidation, to inflict heavy casualties that would slow the advance, perhaps to force a rethinking of the entire operational tempo. The counterattack was set for the morning of the 11th of July, just one day after the main landings. In the darkness before dawn, Axis units began their approach toward the American positions around Gela. What followed was a battle that would test the mettle of American soldiers who had been ashore for barely 24 hours and who still carried within them the shock and disorientation of amphibious assault. The German and Italian forces struck the American lines with considerable violence and some initial success. The 15th Panzer Grenadiers, supported by armor and artillery, pushed back American forward positions and at one point came dangerously close to reaching the beaches where supply operations were underway. The intensity of the attack caught some units off guard, and there were moments when American commanders genuinely feared that the beachhead itself might be overrun. Messages flowed back to General Patton and his staff, describing the severity of the situation, the weight of enemy pressure, and the mounting American casualties. For a few critical hours, the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. Senior American commanders made the decision to commit naval gunfire in direct support of the embattled ground forces. The heavy cruisers and destroyers, anchored offshore, their gun crews trained and ready, began directing their fire onto enemy positions based on spotting reports from observers ashore. The weight of naval artillery, guns that threw shells of devastating caliber with mechanical precision, began turning the tide. The German counterattack, for all its ferocity and tactical competence, ran into barriers that its planners had inadequately appreciated. The American forces ashore, despite their numerical inferiority and their recent arrival, possessed firepower that was distributed throughout their positions in a way that made them extraordinarily difficult to overwhelm through conventional frontal assault. Machine gun positions, supported by mortars and field artillery that American units had succeeded in landing, created interlocking fields of fire that inflicted heavy casualties on attacking formations. The German and Italian units pressing forward found themselves taking casualties at rates that could not be sustained, all while American reserves, troops held in readiness precisely for such emergencies, began flowing into the threatened sector. American infantry, drawing on the training they had received in North Africa and the competitive spirit that animated units that had landed just hours earlier, dug in and held their ground. As the day progressed, the momentum of the Axis attack faltered and then reversed. The German and Italian commanders, lacking sufficient reserves and realizing that they could not sustain the assault against the combined weight of American ground forces and naval gunfire, made the decision to withdraw. This was not a rout or a collapse. The Axis units pulled back in reasonably good order, maintaining their formation and preserving their combat capability for future defensive operations. But the strategic significance of their failure was unmistakable. They had attempted to destroy the American beachhead while it was still weak and uncoordinated, and they had failed. Every hour that now passed brought more American troops ashore, more supplies, more artillery, and more aircraft to improvised airstrips. The window of opportunity that had existed in those first few hours after the landings had closed. What had been possible on the 11th of July would not be possible on the 12th or the 13th. The cost of the German counterattack in human terms was significant on both sides. American soldiers had proven themselves capable of absorbing a serious attack and responding with sufficient firepower and cohesion to repulse an enemy that possessed tactical advantages in armor and artillery support. The losses among German and Italian units had been heavy, representing soldiers and equipment that could not be easily replaced within the theatre. More fundamentally, the counterattack had consumed the last realistic opportunity for the Axis forces to wage anything resembling an offensive campaign in Sicily. From this point forward, the Axis commanders would be forced into an essentially reactive posture, defending terrain, conducting fighting withdrawals, attempting to delay the American and British advances long enough to evacuate troops and equipment across the Strait of Messina before they were trapped on the island. The significance of Gela extended beyond the immediate tactical engagement. For American troops who had been ashore for less than a full day, who carried memories of the chaotic airborne drops and the uncertainty of beach fighting, the successful repulse of a determined enemy counterattack provided something precious, the knowledge that they could stand against the Axis military and prevail. Morale, always fragile in the early stages of a campaign, received a considerable boost from the experience of having been attacked by a formidable enemy and having held their ground. Letters written by American soldiers in the days following the battle captured this sentiment, a mixture of relief at having survived the experience, satisfaction at having contributed to the victory, and growing confidence that the landing force, whatever its initial vulnerabilities, possessed the cohesion and firepower to see the campaign through to success. For General Patton, the successful defense at Gela removed a critical source of concern and vindicated his decision to press forward with the offensive strategy that was taking shape in his mind. The beachhead was secure. The enemy had demonstrated its limited capacity for sustained military operations by committing the greater part of its available forces to a single coordinated attack and failing to achieve decisive results. From this point onward, the question was not whether the Americans would be driven back into the sea, but how rapidly they could advance into the interior of Sicily and how aggressively Patton could pursue his vision of an encircling maneuver that would trap the Axis forces and bring the campaign to a swift conclusion. The Battle of Gela, fought by soldiers whose names were largely forgotten even as the operation itself passed into the historical record, had settled the fundamental question of whether the beachhead would hold. The broader significance of the German counterattack extended to the relationship between the Axis commanders and their superiors in Berlin and Rome. The failure at Gela demonstrated to high-level planners in Berlin that Sicily could not be held through sustained offensive operations. The Axis forces possessed the capability to conduct tactical resistance and to inflict casualties on advancing American and British forces, but they lacked the reserves, the air support, and the overall strategic capability to mount anything resembling a successful defense of the island. Within days of the failed counterattack, German High Command began authorizing the withdrawal of forces from Sicily, recognizing that the island would eventually fall to the Allies, and that the priority must now shift to preserving as many troops as possible for the defense of Italy itself. The decision to evacuate forces across the Strait of Messina, implemented over the following weeks, would have its own dramatic consequences for the campaign. The engagement at Gela also reinforced a pattern that would characterize the entire Sicily campaign: the fragility of Axis military capability when forced to operate against a numerically and materially superior enemy with control of the surrounding waters and skies. German units, for all their professionalism and tactical competence, could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of being outnumbered in a theatre where their enemies possessed overwhelming naval superiority and growing air superiority. Italian units, for their part, demonstrated the limits of their military effectiveness when confronted with determined resistance from American forces that had recovered from the shock of assault and begun to consolidate their position. The counterattack had been conducted with reasonable competence given the circumstances, but competence in execution could not compensate for the strategic realities that underlay the campaign. The Axis forces on Sicily, whatever tactical victories they might achieve, were fighting a campaign they could not win. As American forces consolidated their beachhead in the days following Gela, Patton's planning for the westward and northward drive that would carry his army toward Messina entered a new phase. The enemy had committed his reserve forces and had failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that might have unraveled the American position. From this point forward, the American commander possessed the initiative, the overwhelming advantage in available resources, and the confidence that comes from having successfully defended against a serious attack. The men under his command, having been tested in their first major engagement and having emerged victorious, carried with them a belief in their own capability and in the soundness of their commander's judgment. Gela was not a decision point in the grand strategy of the war, nor was it a battle whose tactical details would be studied for generations by military theorists, but it was a moment when the campaign's ultimate outcome became clear, not merely to the planners in headquarters, but to the ordinary soldiers who had crossed the Mediterranean to fight on a distant island and who now understood with certainty that they would prevail. In the days following the successful repulse of the German counterattack at Gela, American forces under General Patton faced a world of opportunity that had scarcely existed before. The Axis position in Sicily was fracturing. What had begun as a coordinated defensive effort was dissolving into a series of isolated strongpoints and retreating columns. German and Italian units, lacking the strength to hold ground or the mobility to conduct meaningful delaying operations, were being driven steadily backward. Patton recognized this moment with the clarity of a commander who understood the difference between fighting and pursuing. The race was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding across the Sicilian terrain in real time. American forces would sweep westward and northward, covering the interior of the island with a speed that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. The supply lines stretched thin. The men grew exhausted. Yet momentum, once seized, became its own justification. Patton was moving to win, and the road to Palermo became the highway toward both tactical triumph and something deeper, a vindication of his entire philosophy of aggressive warfare. The driving force behind this westward thrust was neither orders from above nor reluctant acceptance of circumstance. It came from Patton's own recognition that the American Seventh Army possessed the opportunity to move faster than the British Eighth Army could move in its sector to the east. Where Montgomery was pressed against thickening German resistance around Catania, forcing him into methodical set-piece operations, Patton's axis of advance cut through terrain where Axis resistance had become scattered and ineffectual. The northwestern route through the Sicilian interior offered longer distances but lighter opposition. American forces could move along roads that were adequate rather than excellent, supplied by truck columns rather than established ports, using mobility and speed to compensate for the length of the journey. This was not recklessness, this was calculation. Patton understood the mathematics of warfare differently than many of his contemporaries. Speed could achieve what superior firepower could not. It could trap enemy forces before they retreated, could seize objectives before defenses could be prepared, could exhaust the enemy through movement rather than attrition. His westward sweep was the expression of this philosophy made manifest across Sicilian dust and broken roads. As American spearheads drove forward into the western reaches of Sicily, the character of the fighting began to shift in ways that reflected the broader collapse of Axis resistance. Towns fell with minimal resistance. In many cases, Italian units simply abandoned their positions as American vehicles appeared on the horizon. The motivation to fight, never strong among Italian conscripts and militiamen, evaporated entirely once it became clear that German forces would not stand and defend alongside them. German units, meanwhile, conducted a skillful fighting withdrawal, but their numbers were too small to do more than delay and harass. They lacked the strength to hold terrain against American advances. They lacked the air support to contest American movement. They lacked the reserves to mount counteroffensive operations. What they possessed was discipline and tactical skill, qualities that allowed them to inflict casualties and slow the American advance without ever being able to stop it. American infantrymen and armor crews found themselves fighting through towns and across open country against enemies who fired and then fell back, who inflicted losses but could not hold ground. The psychology of pursuing a breaking enemy was intoxicating. Officers reported high morale. Soldiers spoke of finally being part of an advance rather than a grinding slog. The momentum became self-reinforcing. The logistical challenge of sustaining this rapid movement was staggering, yet American supply personnel rose to the occasion in ways that later histories sometimes underappreciated. The 7th Army's supply lines stretched back across southern Sicily to the beachheads where American forces had landed less than 2 weeks earlier. Trucks operated around the clock, moving ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies forward to advancing units. Repair shops moved forward behind the spearheads, keeping vehicles running despite the wear and tear of continuous movement across primitive roads. Medical personnel established aid stations and evacuation points that moved with the advance. Water supplies were maintained in country where summer heat drained men and machines alike. Ammunition, always the critical commodity in any offensive operation, flowed forward in quantities sufficient to sustain both pursuit and local fighting. The American logistics system, which had seemed so stretched and stressed in the first days after the landings, demonstrated its fundamental strength and flexibility. Supply officers and enlisted men who never fired a weapon in anger ensured that those who did had what they needed to push forward. This was the invisible foundation of Patton's pursuit, not glamorous, not dramatic, but absolutely essential. The human dimension of this rapid movement across western Sicily deserves its own consideration. American soldiers who had trained in North Africa and then endured the tension of amphibious assault and the shock of combat were now living in a state of continuous motion. Men rode on trucks for hours at a time, hunched in the heat, covered in dust that worked its way into every fold of clothing and every crease of skin. They dismounted to fight through towns that showed no organized resistance. They advanced again, never knowing when they would stop, when they could rest, when they would eat. Officers drove them forward with a mixture of encouragement and profanity. Enlisted men responded with the resilience that comes from momentum and hope. Rumours spread through the columns that they were in a race with the British, that Patton was competing with Montgomery, that reaching certain objectives first mattered for reasons beyond the immediate military situation. Whether soldiers understood or even cared about the strategic implications, they understood that their general wanted to move fast, and that driving forward meant fewer casualties, fewer prolonged engagements, fewer opportunities for the enemy to organize and strike back. The psychology of pursuit is distinct from the psychology of assault. Soldiers understood the difference. This was no longer a desperate struggle for possession of contested ground. This was a chase, and chases had an intoxicating quality. The town of Palermo, Sicily's second-largest city and its principal port, represented both the practical objective of this westward drive and something more symbolically significant. The city sat on the northwestern coast, reachable along roads that led through the interior. It possessed excellent harbour facilities, multiple warehouses for supplies, administrative buildings, and a symbolic importance as the cultural heart of western Sicily. From a military perspective, capturing Palermo would give the American 7th Army a major supply base far superior to the beaches where it had landed. From a psychological perspective, it would be a notable victory, the first major Sicilian city to fall to American forces, a symbol of progress and forward momentum. Patton understood both dimensions of the objective. He drove his forces toward it with explicit intent not merely to seize military infrastructure, but to achieve a victory that would demonstrate American capability and American speed. The race for Palermo thus became intertwined with the larger competition with Montgomery. Every day mattered. Every kilometre of advance mattered. The city represented a milestone in both the practical and political competition for prominence in the Sicily campaign. As American forces approached Palermo from the south and southwest, the Italian garrison and any German forces in the city began their evacuation. The defenders were neither strong enough to hold the city against a determined assault, nor sufficiently motivated to attempt a last stand. Italian military authorities, aware that their nation was sliding toward political upheaval and uncertain of what continued resistance would accomplish, offered only token resistance. German forces, recognizing that Sicily was lost and that every unit extracted from the island was valuable for future operations, prioritized withdrawal over defense. The evacuation proceeded in an atmosphere of chaos and haste, but without the desperate street fighting that had characterized some urban combat in North Africa. Supply dumps were destroyed to prevent capture. Military vehicles were driven northward toward the Messina Straits. Non-essential personnel departed on whatever transportation could be found. By the time American spearheads entered Palermo, the city's military significance had largely departed. What remained was occupation of an empty fortress, the taking of a city whose defenders had already chosen retreat over resistance. American forces entered Palermo in the opening days of August 1943, and the moment carried weight that transcended military utility. Photographs captured American soldiers moving through the city's streets, flags being raised, Italian civilians emerging from their homes to greet or at least observe the new occupiers. Officers established military government operations with impressive speed, designating areas for supplies and personnel, establishing security, beginning the administrative work of occupying a major city. Supply personnel immediately began cataloguing warehouses and assessing port capacity. Engineers assessed harbour facilities and the damage inflicted during air raids. The city was substantially intact, not heavily damaged, and its infrastructure represented a significant gain in American logistical capability. Yet the photographs and reports from Palermo also captured something else: the expression of American victory, the tangible proof that the Seventh Army could move faster, could achieve notable objectives, could accomplish what seemed ambitious when the campaign had begun. Palermo became Patton's symbol of vindication and momentum. The capture of Palermo had an immediate effect on the dynamic between American and British commands. Montgomery, still grinding forward against stiffer resistance in the eastern sector, found his advance contrasted sharply with the rapid American progress in the west. British planners had assumed that the eastern sector, with its road network and proximity to the coast, would be the avenue of quickest advance. Instead, it had become a sector of heavy fighting against concentrated German resistance. American forces, operating along longer but less contested routes through the interior, had seized the initiative and captured Sicily's most important western objective. The political dimension of this success was impossible to ignore. Patton had demonstrated that American forces were capable of aggressive independent operations. He had seized a major objective. He had done so with losses that, while real, were manageable. He had accomplished something that could be presented to American audiences and American commanders as a notable success. The British command was forced to confront the reality that their initial operational plan, with Montgomery driving toward Messina along the primary eastern route, was not unfolding as envisioned. American success in the West raised questions about how Sicily should now be conquered. The capture of Palermo also marked a subtle but significant shift in how the campaign was understood at higher command levels. Supreme Headquarters was forced to acknowledge that rapid American progress was possible, that Patton's aggressive philosophy had merit, and that the competition between American and British forces was becoming operationally significant. Planners who had been comfortable with an orderly, deliberate advance came to recognize that speed had value in its own right. The Italian strategic situation was evolving in ways that made rapid conquest of Sicily more important. The Italian government was beginning peace negotiations with the Allies, and there were concerns about the political implications of how quickly Sicily fell to invading forces. Palermo's capture accelerated this strategic conversation. Patton was no longer merely a subordinate commander executing an assigned sector of a larger plan. He was becoming a figure whose actions shaped the broader direction of the campaign. His success created options and opportunities that had not existed before. Palermo was not merely a city seized, it was a threshold crossed, a moment where the campaign's trajectory began to shift. The psychological turning point that Palermo represented extended beyond command circles to the soldiers in the field. Word that Palermo had fallen spread quickly through American units, still pushing eastward toward Messina. The knowledge that their army had achieved a significant success, that they were moving fast, that the operation was unfolding according to a plan that favored American capability and American aggressiveness, raised morale measurably. Soldiers understood, whether through officers' briefings or through rumor and conversation, that they were now in a race. The knowledge that German and Italian forces were retreating, that terrain was being covered at remarkable speed, that a great city had fallen to their army's advance, all contributed to a sense of momentum and purpose. Men who had endured the shock of amphibious assault and the stress of combat in unfamiliar terrain could now see their efforts bearing fruit. Palermo became real evidence of progress. Letters home mentioned the city's capture. Newspapers celebrated the victory. Officers cited it as justification for continued aggressive operations. The psychological lift from Palermo proved as significant as its logistical value. Yet beneath the celebration and the demonstration of American capability deeper strategic questions remained unresolved. Palermo was secured, but Messina remained the ultimate objective. Montgomery, despite his slower progress in the eastern sector, still commanded the larger force and still represented the more established command structure within the Mediterranean theatre. The path to Messina remained contested and uncertain. German forces, while withdrawing, were not defeated. The race that had begun implicitly in the opening days of the campaign was now explicit, undeniable, and unfolding with visible momentum behind American operations. Patton had seized the initiative. The question that remained was whether he could maintain it, whether American forces could sustain their drive northward and eastward against whatever opposition remained, and whether Palermo's capture would lead to Messina's conquest, or whether it would prove merely a brilliant interlude in a longer struggle. The road stretched forward through terrain that grew more difficult, toward an enemy that still held significant positions, toward a prize that other commanders also sought. Palermo had been taken. Now came the harder test, the final push towards Sicily's northeastern coast, where Messina waited, where the strait separated Sicily from Italian mainland, where the campaign's conclusion and Patton's vindication hung in the balance. While Patton's columns swept across western Sicily like a tide, momentum gathering with each passing day, a very different picture was unfolding on the eastern flank of the island. There, General Bernard Montgomery and his Eighth Army had begun their approach toward Catania, the second largest city in Sicily and the key to controlling the eastern coast. By any conventional measure, the British had started with significant advantages. They held the southern beachhead with its superior ports. They possessed numerical superiority in the landing zones. Their supply lines were shorter and more established. Yet within days of the landing on the 10th of July, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The pace of Montgomery's advance ground steadily downward, hampered by terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to favor the defender, by enemy resistance that stiffened rather than crumbled, and by a strategic vision that prioritized methodical consolidation over audacious speed. The geography of southeastern Sicily presented obstacles that the maps had only hinted at. The plain surrounding Gela and Syracuse, where the British and Canadians had come ashore, eventually gave way to a world of rolling hills and river valleys that climbed toward Mount Etna, Europe's greatest active volcano. These weren't gentle slopes suitable for rapid mechanized movement. They were ravines and scarps that made road networks vulnerable to interdiction. The Axis defenders, though outnumbered and increasingly demoralized, had selected their positions with care along these natural strongpoints. Every river crossing became a potential bottleneck. Every ridgeline offered high ground from which machine gunners and anti-tank crews could exact a price. Montgomery, the methodical general who had proven his mastery of deliberate operations at El Alamein, recognized these realities. He refused to be rushed. He would not trade casualties for speed. This caution, perfectly rational in its own terms, meant that progress measured in kilometers per day would not match the velocity of Patton's westward drive. The Gela counterattack, which we examined in earlier chapters, had particularly sobered the eastern sector commanders. When German panzer units had struck toward the American beachhead on the 11th of July, they had nearly achieved breakthrough. Montgomery feared a similar concentrated push against his own positions. That fear was not entirely unfounded. German and Italian units in the southeastern zone included elements of mobile formations that retained both capacity and intent to defend. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, despite heavy losses suffered during the North African campaign, remained a credible force. The Italian forces in the east, too, fought with more determination in defense of Catania than they had shown in other sectors. Whether this stubbornness reflected local command quality, loyalty to the terrain, or simply the fact that Axis troops rallied more fiercely when properly positioned, remained unclear. What was certain was that Montgomery's advance encountered resistance that American units, encountering more disorganized Italian forces and lighter German formations, did not face. The road to Catania itself became the focus of the entire eastern campaign. The city lay roughly 40 kilometers north of Syracuse, up the coast of the Ionian Sea, with Mount Etna's western slopes rising behind it. Montgomery's strategy called for a direct northward push along the coastal road, the main highway that would lead eventually toward Messina itself. The 717th German Engineer Regiment, operating under orders to delay the British advance for as long as possible, proved notably effective at that task. They demolished bridges, they created rubble obstacles in towns, they mined roads, and withdrew to the next defensible position. Each delay might have seemed marginal in isolation, a few hours here, a few hours there. Cumulatively, these frictions accumulated into days of lost time. The British infantry, though well-trained and disciplined, had to clear towns methodically, clearing basements and fortified positions rather than bypassing them. That was proper tactics and probably necessary for security, yet it was not fast. By the 15th of July, just 5 days into the campaign, the disparity between the two army sectors was becoming visible. While Patton's leading columns were already hundreds of kilometers inland, pushing across the island's interior toward Calasetta and the northern coast, Montgomery's forces had advanced perhaps 60 kilometers from their beachheads. British commanders at headquarters understood the mathematics as clearly as their American counterparts. This was not the breakthrough sweep they had imagined during planning. It was, instead, a grinding advance against an opponent who, though numerically inferior and strategically defeated, refused to vanish quietly into the night. The Canadian forces, operating under British command as part of the 8th Army structure, shared in this frustration. They had fought hard and suffered casualties, yet the prize of Catania remained tantalizingly out of reach, visible from forward positions but not within grasp. The broader implications of Montgomery's slower pace became clearer as Patton's race accelerated. The original operational plan, conceived months earlier in London and Washington, had envisioned a coordinated advance toward Messina from multiple directions. If Montgomery's eastward thrust could maintain rapid progress, while American forces covered the western and central portions of the island, Axis forces could theoretically be compressed and trapped. But compression requires motion from all sides. If one side stalls, the other merely advances into empty space, and trapped enemies become enemies that escape. As Patton's audacious drive westward became known throughout the 8th Army, a question began to gnaw at Montgomery's thinking. Was he allowing the Americans to seize the strategic prize while he remained bogged down in the east? Was caution becoming liability? The professional rivalry between the two commanders, always present beneath a surface of military courtesy, began to sharpen into something more pointed. The terrain north of Catania presented yet another complication. The Strait of Messina, at its narrowest point, lies roughly 4 kilometers from the Sicilian coast to the Italian mainland. As Montgomery's forces pushed northward, they would eventually have to deal with that threshold. Moreover, as the front lines moved toward Catania and beyond, they brought the advance closer and closer to Mount Etna's slopes. The volcano rises to more than 3,000 meters, and its western flank dominates the landscape. Movement becomes constrained on narrow roads that wind through mountain passes. The high ground becomes even more valuable to defenders. A relatively small number of determined soldiers, properly positioned along those mountain roads, could delay a much larger force. German planners, recognizing Sicily's inevitable loss, had already begun thinking about how to extract their forces across the Strait of Messina before they could be encircled. They would use the mountainous terrain to the full, establishing successive defensive lines that required time-consuming assault to break. Meanwhile, the supply situation in the eastern sector began to show the strain of prolonged fighting at reduced speed. Montgomery's forces had to capture undamaged ports and establish robust supply lines to sustain forward operations. Syracuse, the primary port complex in the south, had been partially damaged and required time for repairs. The beachhead itself, though secure, could not indefinitely support the scale of forces being pushed northward. Ammunition, fuel, and food had to flow up roads that were themselves becoming targets for German air attacks and artillery. The German Air Force, though severely outnumbered in Sicily's skies, conducted occasional raids that disrupted supply movements. The Luftwaffe was dying as an institution, but death throes can still inflict casualties. These logistical challenges, never headline news in battle accounts, nonetheless acted as brake on Montgomery's momentum. An army moves only as fast as its supply lines permit. Speed requires not only aggressive commanders, but adequate fuel, ammunition, and food. Montgomery, with his background in logistics and his cautious mentality, would not strip his supply lines bare in pursuit of speed. He would advance as far as his supplies permitted, consolidate, push forward again. It was prudent. It was also slow. By the third week of July, the Patton had calcified into something approaching certainty. Patton's American forces, operating with lighter supply requirements across more open terrain against less determined opposition, were advancing at a pace that Montgomery's more methodical, heavily supplied, heavily supported Eighth Army could not match. The American commander's vision of a race to Messina was not merely ambition speaking, it was grounded in operational reality. Patton's forces could move faster, they were moving faster, and Montgomery's Eastern campaign, honorable and competent though it was becoming the slower route to the ultimate objective. The political and strategic consequences of that fact began to percolate upward through the chain of command. American commanders noted that their forces were bearing the burden of the race. British commanders began to feel the sting of being outpaced. Officers at 15th Army Group headquarters, under General Alexander's command, found themselves managing not merely military operations, but the ego investments of two powerful generals who had believed themselves capable of decisive action. What made the situation more poignant was that Montgomery's advance, taken in isolation, was respectable. He was pushing against coordinated enemy resistance. He was capturing towns and expanding his beachhead. He was inflicting casualties on the enemy and taking ground. By any standard other than the speed at which Patton's columns were sweeping across western Sicily, Montgomery's campaign would have appeared quite successful. British and Canadian soldiers were doing their duty with discipline and courage. They were fighting a proper military campaign with proper support and proper tactics. Yet they were losing something more important than battles. They were losing a race they had not fully understood was being run against them. Montgomery himself was aware of this slowly dawning reality. He was a professional soldier first and a competitor second, but that competitive fire had been kindled by the knowledge that an American general was outmaneuvering him, that an operation conceived in mutual cooperation was becoming a contest, and that his methodical Eastern approach was, by comparison, beginning to look like hesitation. The broader strategic reality suggested that Montgomery might have been vindicated if operations had proceeded differently. An army that is too hasty can overextend itself, snap its supply lines, and find itself suddenly vulnerable. Caution has saved many campaigns from disaster. Yet in Sicily's particular circumstances, the Axis forces lacked the strength to capitalize on Allied mistakes. They could harass, they could delay, they could not decisively defeat either American or British forces if those forces maintained basic tactical competence. Patton, or perhaps his aggressive instincts, had grasped something that Montgomery's cautious doctrine obscured, that sometimes speed itself is a form of power, that momentum can matter more than perfect supply line management, and that daring can succeed when the enemy has already decided that he is beaten, even if he hasn't quite admitted it to himself. By this logic, Montgomery's eastern approach was not merely slow but strategically suboptimal. It was playing the enemy's game rather than imposing one's own will upon the battlefield. Whether Montgomery could have maintained Patton's pace, given his sector's terrain and opposition, remained a matter of professional debate. That he was not attempting the speed Patton had achieved seemed clear to everyone watching. As the last days of July approached, Montgomery's forces continued their grinding advance toward Catania. The city remained just out of reach, defended with stubborn determination by German rearguards, who understood that their time in Sicily was limited but refused to spend it in retreat. Every captured town, every bridge crossed, every ridge assaulted represented progress. Yet none of it changed the fundamental equation, that while Montgomery pushed methodically northward along the eastern coast, Patton had already swept across the island, captured Palermo, and was now wheeling his forces eastward along the northern roads in a dash toward Messina. The race, once merely implicit in the campaign's structure, had become the defining story of Operation Husky. Montgomery was losing it, and he knew it, and the knowledge itself began to drive calculations about strategy, resources, and the future that would extend far beyond Sicily's shores. By mid-July 1943, the illusion of a unified Allied strategy in Sicily had fractured beyond repair. What had begun as a coordinated operation between American and British forces, each with a defined sector, each with complementary objectives, had transformed into something far more primal, a competition for scarce resources, for command authority, and for the historical record. The 7th Army under Patton and the 8th Army under Montgomery were no longer simply fighting the Germans and Italians. They were fighting each other for the lifeblood of modern warfare: fuel, ammunition, transport, and air cover. Behind the front lines, in tents and command posts from Malta to North Africa, officers hunched over maps and supply manifests, calculating not merely what their forces needed to win, but what they could extract from an Allied logistics system stretched to its breaking point. The arithmetic of war in the Mediterranean was brutal and finite. Every ton of ammunition that went to Patton's advancing columns was a ton unavailable to Montgomery's grinding assault on the eastern heights. Every fighter squadron allocated to escort American supply trucks was a squadron absent when British units needed air support. The ships that ferried reinforcements to Sicily's beaches could not be in two places simultaneously. The trucks that rumbled along dusty Sicilian roads toward American positions represented vehicles that could have supported Montgomery's slower but equally demanding operations in the island's rougher terrain. This was the hidden war, the one fought in quartermaster offices and command headquarters, where decisions made by men studying charts determined not abstract military advantage, but the flesh and blood capacity of soldiers to continue fighting. The American logistical system, though efficient, was not infinite. The British system, though well organized, faced the additional burden of operating across greater distances and through more challenging terrain. Neither could simultaneously feed an all-out offensive by both armies at full intensity. What made the situation combustible was the growing evidence that Patton's strategic vision, his audacious drive westward and then northward toward Messina, was working. Where Montgomery faced entrenched German defenses around Catania, methodical resistance that demanded careful tactical preparation, Patton's columns were encountering collapsing Axis positions. The Italian forces were melting away. German units, stretched thin across the island, lacked the reserves to plug every gap or hold every ridge. The American advance was accelerating precisely because Patton had recognized this moment of enemy weakness and was exploiting it with movement and speed. Yet this very success created a dilemma for the Allied High Command. If Patton's rapid drive offered the genuine prospect of trapping or destroying substantial Axis forces before they could escape across the Strait of Messina, then would it not be militarily rational to concentrate resources behind his offensive? But to do so would be to acquiesce to American dominance of the campaign, to demote the British Eighth Army from co-equal partner to secondary effort. The decision was not purely military. It was political, institutional, and deeply personal. General Alexander, the overall commander of the campaign, occupied an extraordinarily delicate position. He bore responsibility for the campaign's success, yet he sat atop a structure that was, in many respects, bicephalous. Patton answered ultimately to General Omar Bradley, the American Corps commander, who answered to General Dwight Eisenhower. Montgomery answered through different channels, through different systems of command, through different expectations. Alexander, himself British but commanding in a theatre where American forces were substantial and growing, had to manage the ambitions of two powerful subordinates without visibly favoring either, in a way that might poison future cooperation. Early in the campaign, the operational design had given Montgomery the primary axis of advance, the eastern route toward Catania and ultimately Messina. But as the days passed and reality diverged from the plan, as American progress outpaced British progress, a subtle but unmistakable shift occurred in Alexander's priorities and his allocation of resources. The shift was not dramatic. It was not announced through formal orders or grand strategic pronouncements. It was visible instead in the accumulated weight of small decisions. Which supplies came ashore first, which units received priority air support, which roads and harbors were designated as primary logistics routes. The fuel situation became the clearest arena for this invisible war. Motorized warfare devours petroleum. Patton's armored columns, racing across Sicily's interior, consumed gasoline at an almost frantic rate. A single day of rapid mechanized advance could require more fuel than a static sector consumed in a week of routine operations. The supply lines from North Africa to Sicily were long and vulnerable. The tonnage available aboard ships was limited. The storage facilities ashore were still being constructed and expanded. Every decision about how much fuel to allocate between sectors carried enormous consequences. Early in the campaign, fuel was distributed roughly according to the numerical strength of each army, but as the situation evolved, as evidence accumulated that Patton's drive was both succeeding and offering genuine strategic advantage, those allocations shifted subtly toward the Americans. Supply officers in the rear areas, responding to directives from commanders responsive in turn to Alexander's vision, began channeling additional fuel toward American transport units. These were not dramatic reallocations. The adjustments were incremental, embedded in the routine decisions of logistics. Yet they accumulated into something substantial. Ammunition followed a similar pattern. A sustained offensive requires not merely movement but firepower. Artillery to suppress enemy positions, small arms ammunition to sustain firefights, the steady replenishment of ordnance stocks. Montgomery's assault on Catania demanded heavy artillery support to compensate for the defenders' advantages of terrain and fortification. The British system was superb at concentrating firepower. British artillery doctrine emphasized precision and deliberation. Yet these very virtues meant that ammunition consumption was calibrated differently from the American approach, where a bunplay of supply permitted more aggressive and profligate use of firepower. As Patton's advance accelerated, and as commanders recognized that speed and momentum could substitute for carefully prepared artillery preparation, American ammunition supplies were expanded. Supply officers made these decisions not through explicit strategic guidance, but through the cumulative effect of responding to forward commanders' requests. Patton's subordinates, recognizing that their supply situation was improving, became more aggressive in their requests, more confident in their ability to maintain momentum. The system responded to success. The competition for air support embodied the same dynamics at a higher level of visibility. The Mediterranean theater possessed a limited number of fighter squadrons available for tactical support. Every fighter allocated to one sector was unavailable elsewhere. The air commander, operating under overall strategic guidance but with considerable independence in tactical allocation, had to make decisions about which army would receive priority air cover on any given day. Early in the campaign, these decisions had been more evenly distributed, but as Patton's drive accelerated, as the opportunity for a decisive maneuver became apparent, priority air support increasingly flowed toward American operations. Fighter squadrons were vectored toward American columns to protect them from air attack and provide reconnaissance. Bomber support for American operations, particularly close air support for advancing troops, became increasingly available. This was not conspiracy. It reflected instead the way military systems respond to success and perceived opportunity. The air commander observed that American forces were advancing faster, offered better prospects for decisive results, and therefore represented a more profitable investment of scarce air resources. The supply of transport, trucks, vehicles, and beasts of burden became another arena where the competition for resources played out. Motorized warfare requires vehicles in extraordinary quantities. Every forward airfield needs transport to keep it supplied. Every advancing column needs organic transport for ammunition and fuel. Every rear area needs vehicles for lateral movement. The Mediterranean theater had limited vehicle availability. Replacements came from overseas with difficulty. Captured enemy vehicles could be cannibalized for parts, but rarely contributed net new transport capacity. As American columns advanced deeper into Sicily, their transport requirements grew exponentially. Supply lines stretched backward hundreds of kilometers. Maintaining those lines required constant allocation of precious vehicles. Initially, vehicles were parceled out according to rough proportionality, but as the campaign evolved, American transport needs were consistently met, while British requests occasionally went partially unsatisfied. This was not dramatic disparity. The difference between adequate and excellent supply is often a matter of percentages, yet percentages matter in war. When an American column's supply trucks arrive on schedule, momentum continues. When delays occur, advance slows. The politics underlying these decisions were complex and multifaceted. Alexander, though British, understood that American public opinion and American institutional weight were increasingly shaping the war. The United States was providing the majority of material resources flowing into the Mediterranean. American strength was growing, while British strength, though still substantial, faced constraints in manpower and production. Political reality demanded that the campaign succeed. Military reality suggested that Patton's drive offered the best prospect for decisive success. To allocate resources differently, to maintain priority support for Montgomery's methodical advance, despite its slower progress, would be to subordinate military logic to British institutional pride. Alexander was a skilled enough commander to grasp this calculus. His decisions about resource allocation reflected not hostility to Montgomery, but rather cold calculation about how to achieve the fastest strategic success. Yet inevitably, these decisions fostered resentment. Montgomery understood perfectly well what was happening. His letters and reports from this period reveal growing frustration at perceived slights in resource allocation, at insufficient air support, at what he interpreted as deliberate downgrading of the Eighth Army's priority. Montgomery was not a man inclined towards stoic acceptance of what he regarded as unfair treatment. His relationship with Patton had been cordial enough at the campaign's outset, but the divergence in their command's fortunes had transformed cordiality into barely concealed rivalry. Montgomery's own personality, his need to be recognized as the senior commander, his conviction that careful planning and methodical execution were superior to bold improvisation, made him increasingly sensitive to anything that suggested his role was being diminished. The supply situation, with its accumulating pattern of allocations favoring American operations, felt to Montgomery like a tangible expression of that diminishment. Whether these allocations were fully intentional or largely reflexive, whether they reflected conscious strategic choice or the natural workings of a system responding to demonstrated success, was perhaps less important than the fact that Montgomery perceived them as deliberate slight. The practical consequences of this resource competition were subtle but real. Montgomery's advance remained steady but grinding. Without decisive priority in air support, without the surge in additional fuel that might have permitted more aggressive mobile operations, without the intensity of logistical backing that could have supported a more rapid tempo, the British and Canadian forces proceeded at a pace that was militarily sound but strategically disappointing. The terrain around Catania worked against rapid advance. German resistance was more determined. British doctrine emphasized careful coordination and deliberate preparation. But the resource constraints bit into the margins that might have accelerated the campaign. Patton's advance, conversely, accelerated into a remarkable crescendo. Additional fuel kept his columns moving. Sufficient ammunition permitted aggressive forward operations. Air support provided cover and reconnaissance. The system had tilted toward him, gradually, and for reasons that blended military logic with institutional and political reality. The more Patton succeeded, the more resources were justified as supporting the most profitable strategic venture. The more resources were allocated to his operations, the greater his success became. The competition for resources had transformed into a self-reinforcing cycle. By late July, as American forces approached Palermo and the magnitude of Patton's operational success became undeniable, the resource allocation patterns had solidified into a new equilibrium. Patton's 7th Army was receiving priority support. Montgomery's 8th Army was receiving adequate but no longer preeminent support. This was not stated in orders or acknowledged in official communiques. It was instead the cumulative result of dozens of decisions made by supply officers, air commanders, and operational planners, each responding to their immediate situation, each making rational choices within their sphere of authority. Yet together these decisions reflected and reinforced a strategic reality. The race for Messina was now acknowledged, however tacitly, as the dominant objective of the campaign. American forces had won the scramble for resources not through force of argument or military brilliance in the conventional sense, but through demonstrated success and the institutional reality of American weight within the coalition, the scramble for resources had not been merely military competition. It had been the logical working out of political, institutional, and strategic pressures under conditions of scarcity. And it had tipped the balance decisively toward the American drive for Messina. By late July 1943, the American Seventh Army stood at a crossroads that was both obvious and urgent. Palermo had fallen, supplies were flowing inland through a functional harbour, and Patton's divisions had tasted the exhilaration of rapid advance across open terrain. But the real prize lay ahead, northeast, across the northern coast and then eastward toward the Strait of Messina. This was not merely a question of geography. It was a question of momentum, of will, and of how far a commander could push his men and machines when victory seemed to hover just beyond the horizon. The terrain ahead would worsen. The Axis forces, though fractured and retreating, had not vanished. And yet the American army moved as though propelled by something beyond mere orders, a sense that the race was entering its final climactic phase, and that hesitation now would be a form of surrender. The wheeling movement began almost as soon as Palermo secured its harbour operations. Patton's strategy had evolved from a raiding concept into a comprehensive manoeuvre. American forces would drive north along the western coast toward Trapani and beyond, then pivot dramatically eastward along Sicily's northern rim, using the coastal roads as highways toward Messina. The northern coast offered advantages that the interior roads could not match. The sea lay to the north, preventing any flanking movement from that direction. Supply lines could be maintained by naval vessels operating in relatively shallow, friendly waters. And the distances, while still formidable, were at least measurable, roughly 130 kilometers from Palermo to Messina as the crow might fly, less across the road network when the turns and switchbacks were counted. Patton calculated that his army could traverse that ground in days, not weeks. Montgomery, still grinding forward against stiffening resistance near Catania, was nowhere close to such a timeline. The race had become not just tactically visible, but strategically undeniable. The push westward and northward from Palermo encountered varying degrees of resistance that ranged from nuisance to nominal. Italian forces continued their pattern of local defense, followed by rapid withdrawal. Some units simply disbanded, with soldiers slipping away to villages or back toward their homes. German forces, fewer in number and stretched thin across the island, fought delaying actions intended to slow the American advance rather than reverse it. The Axis High Command knew that Sicily was lost. The only question remaining was how much of the remaining Axis force could escape across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy before the Americans sealed that narrow gap. Every delay bought precious hours and allowed more personnel to flee. But from the American perspective, every delay was an affront, a friction point that slowed the inevitable conclusion. The combat along the northern roads was sharp but brief, a series of sharp skirmishes rather than sustained engagements. American armor would push forward, infantry would suppress the defenders, and within hours, the Axis troops would vanish into the hills or race eastward in whatever transport remained available to them. The terrain itself became Patton's most significant opponent in this final phase. The roads along Sicily's northern coast, always narrow and winding, deteriorated noticeably as American forces advanced beyond the areas already consolidated. Switchbacks cut into mountainsides, forcing heavy vehicles to navigate hairpin turns at reduced speed. Bridges, damaged during the assault phase or destroyed by German demolition teams, had to be repaired or bypassed, creating delays measured in hours that felt like days to commanders obsessed with pace. Small towns clung to cliff sides or perched in mountain passes, and clearing them, even when resistance was minimal, required the methodical work of infantry supported by armor that could not navigate the narrowest streets. Yet Patton's forces adapted. Engineers worked around the clock repairing roads and bridges. Infantry learned to move quickly through towns, maintaining momentum even if not speed. Supply convoys, long and vulnerable along single-track roads, moved in coordinated bounds, leapfrogging ammunition and fuel forward as each segment of road came under American control. The army that had crossed the interior of Sicily in a blaze of speed now faced a different trial. The grinding advance along a coastline where every kilometer demanded ingenuity and sweat. The condition of Patton's troops reflected the strain of continuous operations. Men who had landed in Sicily just 3 weeks prior had now been in motion almost constantly, sleeping in shifts, eating from ration boxes, living in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. The Mediterranean heat of July, intense, relentless, with no respite even after darkness fell, sapped strength and created medical challenges that medics and regimental surgeons worked tirelessly to address. Heat exhaustion became as common as small arms fire. Water discipline became a survival skill. Yet morale remained extraordinary. These were men who had crossed North Africa, landed in a hostile country, and now pursued an enemy in visible retreat. The sense that Sicily's end was near, that Messina could be reached before the month was gone, created a psychological climate where discomfort was endured without complaint, and exhaustion was set aside for the sake of the next objective. Soldiers understood, in ways that only men engaged in war can understand, that the final days of a campaign often determined its historical narrative. To be among those who reached Messina first meant something not just to Patton, but to the men themselves. Logistics, the unglamorous mathematics that underlies all military movement, strained dangerously as the pace of advance accelerated. The supply line extending back to Palermo and ultimately to the beaches near Gela, where the invasion had begun, now stretched nearly 200 kilometers. Trucks traveled that distance daily, carrying ammunition, fuel, water, and rations forward while evacuating wounded to the rear. Every bridge repair, every town cleared, every unexpected delay rippled backward through the entire supply network. Quartermaster units worked with mechanical precision, calculating consumption rates, managing stockpiles, and attempting to predict where supplies would be needed 2 days hence. But calculation was always playing catch-up with Patton's ambition. The commander repeatedly asked for more speed, more fuel, more ammunition, the supplies that would allow the army to maintain momentum without pause. Supply officers, working under Patton's relentless pressure and the constraints of limited shipping capacity, performed minor miracles to keep the advance mobile. Yet everyone involved knew that the margin for error was shrinking, that maintaining this pace could not continue indefinitely, that something would have to give eventually. For now, it held. The American divisions involved in this northern thrust represented the cream of the 7th Army's combat power. Armor units, particularly medium tank companies equipped with the Sherman tank, formed the spearhead of most advance columns. Infantry divisions, reinforced with attached engineers and artillery, provided the staying power and the ability to clear terrain of resistance. 1,000 or more vehicles moved daily across those northern roads, a river of American military power flowing eastward with inexorable purpose. Patton himself moved forward frequently, observing the advance, meeting with division commanders, pushing and probing for any additional acceleration. He understood the stakes not just militarily but personally. The race with Montgomery was no longer hypothetical. The American advance was outpacing the British advance measurably, and the implications for command, for American prestige, and for Patton's own historical reputation all converged on the objective of reaching Messina first. His presence at the front was not mere theatre, it was the physical expression of an absolute commitment to victory in this particular race. The Axis-delaying actions, though increasingly sparse, demonstrated the enemy's inability to do more than buy time. German defensive positions, hastily prepared and thinly held, would be identified by American scouts or simply encountered when leading elements of the advance guard came into contact. Artillery would be called forward. Infantry would maneuver to flank or assault the position directly. Within hours, often less, the defenders would either withdraw or be overwhelmed. The pattern repeated itself dozens of times along the northern coast. The Germans and Italians remaining in Sicily lacked the strength for a counterattack and the space for a sustained linear defense. Their best strategic asset was the sea itself, the Strait of Messina, which remained a barrier against American advance and a highway for evacuation across to Calabria on the mainland. German ferries and Italian naval vessels, operating mostly at night when Allied air superiority was less oppressive, shuttled personnel and equipment across that narrow channel. For every soldier who reached the opposite shore, the German commander knew he had preserved a potential defender for the Italian mainland. But those same evacuations meant that Sicily was being surrendered in pieces, a slow-motion capitulation that was already certain in outcome, even if not yet complete in execution. As American forces pushed steadily eastward along the coast, the realization that Messina was within reach began to permeate the ranks. Not merely reachable in the abstract, but graspable, approachable, a place that soldiers could believe they might see within days. Scouts reported sightings of the city from hilltops. Officers studied maps with renewed urgency, calculating distances that had contracted from hundreds of kilometers to tens. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical progress. Exhaustion that might have broken the spirit of troops months or years into a campaign became almost irrelevant when the finish line was visible on the horizon. Combat efficiency, measured in how quickly positions were organized and attacks were pressed home, actually increased. Speed became not just a tactical preference, but a moral imperative. Patton fed this sense of urgency constantly, in orders that emphasized rapidity, in personal appearances that communicated absolute priority to reaching Messina before any other force could claim that victory. The arrival of American forces at towns north of Palermo and eventually along the northern coast itself brought moments of unexpected encounter with Sicilian civilians who had endured weeks of war, occupation, and the knowledge that their island had become a contested battlefield. Some welcomed American soldiers with genuine relief that the invasion had been successful, that the war was moving onward, that their long nightmare might finally be ending. Others were simply curious, watching foreign soldiers and equipment pass through their villages with the detached interest of people too exhausted by events to react with much emotion. Supply troops, moving through these towns in support of the combat advance, sometimes found opportunities for brief rest and local hospitality. These moments were transitory and small against the larger backdrop of the campaign, yet they represented the texture of war beyond the combat itself, the intersections of military movement with civilian life, the strange proximity of violence and ordinary existence that characterized operations on inhabited terrain. The final approach to Messina, as the American advance columns drew closer in the final days of July and the opening days of August, took on an almost dreamlike quality. The city itself, visible at last to lead elements of the American forces, represented the culmination of weeks of planning, 3 weeks of continuous combat and movement, and Patton's personal obsession with reaching it before Montgomery's forces could claim a share of the victory. The roads narrowed further as they approached the city, winding through hills that rose above the Strait of Messina itself. The sea that had protected the strait and allowed Axis forces to evacuate now dominated the landscape visually and psychologically. Across that narrow gap, barely more than 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, lay mainland Italy, the next objective, the next campaign, the next phase of the war. But for now, the focus was entirely on Messina, on entering the city, on planting the American flag there, on making undeniable the fact that Patton's vision of rapid maneuver and aggressive exploitation of success had succeeded not just tactically, but strategically. The momentum that had built across 3 weeks of continuous advance would reach its crescendo within hours. The race that had shaped the campaign, that had driven 2 commanders into competition that transcended Allied brotherhood, was entering its final moments. American soldiers, dust-covered and exhausted but still moving forward, pushed through the final obstacles knowing that history was being written in real time, that their actions in these last hours would determine how the campaign would be remembered, and that Messina, symbol and prize of the entire Sicilian conquest, lay just ahead. The final weeks of July cast long shadows across Sicily's northern coast. American spearheads had begun their eastward pivot, swinging around the island's rugged terrain toward a city that had become the fulcrum of ambition and rivalry. Messina waited at the northeast corner of Sicily, roughly only 40 kilometers from the Italian mainland across the Strait of Messina. For General Patton, it represented vindication, proof that his strategy of aggressive movement and bold decentralization had outpaced the methodical caution of his British counterpart. For General Montgomery, approaching from the south, Messina represented a destination that seemed to recede with each passing day, a bitter reminder that terrain and determined German resistance had conspired to slow his advance to a crawl. The city itself held profound symbolic weight beyond its military value. Messina was Sicily's second-largest port, a gateway to the Italian peninsula, and the prize that would declare, unambiguously, which commander had orchestrated the campaign's most decisive maneuver. By late July, the American advance from Palermo had gathered tremendous momentum. Patton's forces had traveled westward, then wheeled northward to seize the coast at places like Cefalù, and were now driving east along the coastal roads toward their objective. The speed of this movement was extraordinary, given the limitations of Mediterranean logistics and the damage the Allies themselves had inflicted on Sicily's road network during earlier operations. Engineers worked ceaselessly to repair or improvise passages, while supply columns pushed forward in clouds of dust, racing to keep Patton's columns fueled and armed. The American general understood that speed itself was a weapon, not merely a tactical advantage, but a statement of capability and will. His subordinates, officers like General Omar Bradley and his divisional commanders, had become accustomed to Patton's relentless pressure for faster movement, and they had learned to respond. Discipline and organization held the advance together, even as the pace threatened to scatter units across 100 kilometers of Sicily's interior. The terrain confronting the Americans as they drove eastward was punishing. The coastal roads were narrow and winding, clinging to cliffsides that offered perfect opportunities for Axis-delaying actions. German engineers had fortified choke points, mined bridges, and left behind small holding parties with orders to resist and slow rather than to stand and be overwhelmed. These were no longer the disorganized rearguards of the first weeks. These were calculated defensive positions manned by professional soldiers who understood that buying time might allow evacuation across the Strait of Messina. Yet the Americans had learned how to handle such resistance. Air superiority provided reconnaissance and tactical support that made German defensive lines vulnerable. American artillery could saturate positions far more thoroughly than the Italians or Germans could hope to match. And perhaps most importantly, the American soldiers themselves had developed battlefield confidence. They knew now that they could overcome any position the Axis chose to defend. The initial fears of the invasion had given way to the certainty that they would prevail. Montgomery's Eighth Army, meanwhile, remained locked in a grueling advance against stiffer opposition in the eastern hills. The terrain around Catania and extending northward into the mountains favored defense far more than the open plains of western Sicily. German forces under officers like General Fridolin von Senger and Ettelin were fighting with skill and determination, using the terrain to maximum advantage. British and Canadian progress was measured in kilometers per day rather than the tens of kilometers that Patton's forces were regularly achieving. The disparity was becoming undeniable, both to the commanders themselves and to the press, to the troops, and to the political leadership following the campaign from distant capitals. Photographs appeared in newspapers showing American soldiers at Palermo, then further east. American communiques spoke of thousands of prisoners taken and dozens of towns liberated. Meanwhile, British official statements increasingly emphasized the importance of the eastern sector, the difficulty of the terrain, the resistance being encountered, language that subtly shifted the frame from a race to a grinding campaign of attrition where Montgomery's methodical approach was precisely what the circumstances demanded. The weather,